Sheriff Gideon Rusk slammed both palms flat on the mercantile counter so hard that the glass jars rattled against each other, and a ceramic mug fell to the floor and shattered. He leaned across until his face was inches from old Hector Serrano's, and his voice came out low and wet, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to make a man's bowels go cold. "You've got until Friday, old man. After that, I start finding violations." Hector's hands were shaking. He was 63 years old, had built that store from nothing, and now this man with a badge was telling him that everything he'd worked for could be taken because he refused to hand his daughter over like she was livestock at an auction. Maribel was standing in the back room. She heard every word. And something inside her stopped being afraid and started being something else entirely. If you've ever watched someone you love get backed into a corner by someone who is supposed to protect them, you already know exactly how Maribel Serrano felt in that moment. You already know that burning, helpless, furious feeling of watching injustice move through a room like it owns the place. This is a story about what happens when one woman refuses to accept that, and about the quiet, scarred, overlooked man she chose to stand beside her. Before we go any further, if stories like this are what you come here for, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss one. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels now. Let's go back to where it all began. Silas Mercer turned 38 that spring without ceremony. He woke before 4 in the morning the way he always did, pulled on boots that had been resoled twice, and walked out into the dark to check on a heifer that had been running a slight fever the night before. The stars were still out. The air smelled like dust and dry grass and the faint sweetness of cedar coming off the hills. He stood beside the heifer for a while, one hand resting on her flank, feeling her breathe. She was better. He gave her fresh water and walked back to the house. There was no cake, no whiskey, no one sitting at the table when he got back inside. He made coffee, drank it black, and went back to work. That was the rhythm of his life. That had been the rhythm of his life for 11 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough money to buy this 40-acre parcel on the rough side of the county. The side nobody else wanted because the soil was hard and the creek ran shallow half the year, and the nearest road was 3 miles of rutted track that turned to mud soup every time it rained. People in Red Willow called the place Mercer's Mistake for a while, until they got bored of it and started just calling it nothing at all. Silas didn't mind the name. He'd heard worse. He'd also heard every variation of what the townspeople thought of him, because people in small towns don't work hard to lower their voices when they're talking about somebody they've already written off. He wasn't disliked, exactly. Nobody had anything truly bad to say about Silas Mercer. He paid his debts on time. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't start fights or cheat at cards or run his mouth. He was, by most measures of frontier decency, a good man. But good and wanted are two entirely different things, and Red Willow had made its judgment clear enough. Silas was the kind of man a town respected from a distance and forgot up close. He'd learned to live with that. Took a few years, and it wasn't clean. Learning there were nights he sat on the porch and stared at the dark and felt the quiet press against him like something physical, like a hand on his chest. But eventually he made his peace with it, the way a man makes peace with a bad knee or a scar that never quite fades. You stop expecting it to be different. You stop reaching for something that's already made it clear it isn't coming. The one time he'd let himself believe otherwise had ended badly enough that he'd stopped keeping score. Her name was Catherine, and she'd come through Red Willow with her family 7 years back, passing through on their way to somewhere else. She'd ended up staying, and for 8 months, Silas had genuinely thought that maybe the life he'd built had enough value to offer another person. He'd shown her the ranch, the cattle, the garden he kept along the south fence. He'd talked about the future, careful and halting, the way a man talks about something he's not used to saying out loud. Catherine had listened. She'd smiled. She'd been kind about it. And then she'd told him, gently, as though she was doing him a favor, that she needed more than this. That quiet wasn't the same as peace, that a man who didn't know how to want things for himself couldn't give her what she needed. She wasn't wrong exactly. That was the part that stuck. He replayed it sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, but with the dull ache of something understood too late. She'd seen something in him that he couldn't argue with, and the part of him that had believed he deserved more than loneliness had gone quiet after that, the way a dog goes quiet after it's been kicked too many times. Not dead, just trained. So Silas worked. He expanded the herd slowly, 3 or 4 animals at a time. He repaired the north fence for the 4th time. He taught himself to keep better records after losing a dispute over a bill of sale he couldn't document properly. He got better at small, practical things. He got worse at hoping for large ones. That was his life in the spring. He turned 38. That was his life until the afternoon Maribel Serrano rode onto his property alone, tied her horse to his fence post without asking permission, walked up to his porch steps, and looked him straight in the eye with the expression of a woman who had already made up her mind and was only here as a matter of courtesy. He'd seen Maribel before, the way everyone in Red Willow had seen everyone else at the Mercantile when he picked up supplies at the occasional gathering in the town square, passing on the street. She was 31, dark-eyed, with her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's composure, the kind of woman who moved through a room as though she'd already calculated the fastest way out of it and chosen to stay anyway. She was not the kind of woman who rode alone to a man's ranch in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been mending a harness on the porch steps. He stood up when he saw her coming, not because he was expecting anything, just because that's how his mother had raised him. "Miss Serrano," he said. He didn't know what else to say. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She said, "I need to talk to you about something serious, Silas. I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out before you say anything." He noticed his hands still had the harness oil on them. He didn't know why he noticed that. He said, "All right." She said, "I want you to marry me." The afternoon went very quiet. Silas heard the cattle in the far pasture. He heard a hawk somewhere above them, making that distant, thin cry. He heard his own heartbeat do something strange and uneven, like a man who's been walking a straight line for years and suddenly found the ground moving under his feet. He said, "I'm sorry." "I know how that sounds," Maribel said. "I'm not here because I've lost my mind, and I'm not here because of some romantic notion. I'm here because I've thought about this for 2 weeks, and you're the only person I believe can actually help my family. So I'm asking you to hear me out." He sat back down on the porch steps. Not because he was dismissing her, just because his legs made that choice before his brain did. She sat on the step beside him, not close, properly sideways where she could look at him directly. And she told him about Gideon Rusk. Silas knew the sheriff the way everyone in Red Willow knew the sheriff, which is to say he'd always felt the wrongness of the man without being able to point to any single thing that proved it. Rusk was smooth in the way that certain dangerous things were smooth river ice, old rope, the smile of someone who needs something from you. He'd been sheriff for 4 years, appointed after the previous man had a convenient riding accident on a road he'd traveled 100 times. Nobody said anything out loud about the convenience of that accident. Nobody said anything out loud about most things where Rusk was concerned. Maribel told him how it started. 2 years ago, Rusk had come into the Mercantile after closing time, when her father was alone doing the books. Rusk had explained, in that calm, reasonable tone of his, that the Mercantile had some irregularities in its business licensing that the county might need to investigate. He'd said it was probably nothing. He'd said he'd be happy to smooth things over as a favor to a valued member of the community. Hector Serrano was not a stupid man. He understood immediately what was happening. He paid the first amount because he didn't see another way, and because Maribel's mother was sick that year, and the last thing he could afford was a legal fight with the man who controlled the town's law. The amounts got larger. The threats got more specific. And then, 8 months ago, Rusk had shifted from money to something else. He wanted Maribel. She said it flatly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. He'd told her father that his patience with the financial arrangement was running thin, that he'd found what he really wanted, and that if Hector could see his way to encouraging his daughter to accept Rusk's courtship, the financial difficulties might simply resolve themselves. He doesn't want a wife, Maribel said. He wants something he owns. He wants my father to hand me to him so that he has leverage over our entire family for the rest of our lives. And my father is 63 years old and his hands shake when he thinks no one's watching, and he can't sleep, and he's aged 10 years in the last 2 because of this man. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why me?" She looked at him. "Because you can't be bought. Everyone in this county knows that. Rusk knows that too, which means you're the only man in Red Willow who he genuinely can't get to. If we're married, legally married, before witnesses, there's nothing left for him to threaten my father with. The leverage disappears. He'll come after me instead," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "He will." She didn't soften it. He respected that. "And you thought I'd agree to this," he said, not accusing. Genuinely asking. "I thought you might," she said. "Because you've spent 11 years building something out of nothing, and the one thing everyone agrees about Silas Mercer, even the people who've written you off, is that you don't back down from hard things." She paused. "And because I think you're lonely enough that a marriage of mutual benefit might not sound as strange to you as it would to other people." That landed somewhere uncomfortable, because it was true, and she knew it, and she'd said it anyway, because she was the kind of person who said true things even when they were uncomfortable. He should have felt offended. He didn't. He felt for the first time in a very long time like someone was actually looking at him. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that a lesser woman would have started filling the silence. Maribel didn't. She sat there and let him think. He thought about Catherine and what she'd said about a man who didn't know how to want things for himself. He thought about the ranch and the hard soil and the cattle he'd built a herd from by stubborn increments. He thought about Hector Serrano's hands shaking in the back of that mercantile while a man with a badge pressed him into a corner. He thought about what it meant to be a man nobody was afraid of losing. He thought about what it might mean, just once, to do something that mattered to someone other than himself. He said, "I'll need to think about this overnight." Maribel stood up. "That's fair." She brushed off her skirt. "I'll come back tomorrow at the same time. You rode out here alone," he said. "I ride everywhere alone," she said. "I'm careful." "Rusk have people watching your family?" She paused. And that pause told him everything. "Probably," she said. "Then don't come back tomorrow," he said. "I'll come to town. I'll stop into the mercantile for supplies, the way I normally do. We'll talk there." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it, like recognition. Like she was confirming something she'd suspected. "All right," she said. She untied her horse and mounted without assistance and rode back down the track toward the main road. Silas stood on his porch and watched her go. That night he did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and argued with himself the way a man argues with himself when he already knows what he's going to decide but hasn't admitted it yet. He went through all the reasons it was foolish, the reasons it would bring trouble down on the ranch he'd spent 11 years building. The reasons a practical man who'd already accepted his particular life didn't blow it up for someone else's problem. And then he thought about Rusk's face, the way Rusk moved through town. The particular quality of authority that Rusk's wore, the kind that had never been challenged because it had never needed to be. Because the right kind of fear in the right number of people is enough to hold a whole county in place without firing a single shot. Silas had never been a man who looked for fights, but he'd spent 40 years learning, slowly and often painfully, the difference between a fight worth having and one that wasn't. He got up at 3:30 in the morning and sat at his table and opened the ledger he kept for ranch expenses. He flipped to the blank pages in the back. He picked up his pen. And in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, he wrote one line at the top of a clean page. "What Gideon Rusk has done to the Serrano family, Then he set the pen down and thought for a while. Then he picked it back up and started writing everything he knew. The next morning, he drove the wagon into Red Willow. He stopped at the mercantile and bought flour and coffee and a coil of wire he didn't particularly need. Hector Serrano wrapped the purchases in paper and said nothing personal and kept his hands busy and his eyes averted, which was the behavior of a man who'd learned that every conversation might be watched. Maribel was stacking bolts of cloth on the far shelf. She glanced at him once, the way a person glances at a stranger. Silas put his coins on the counter. He said to Hector quietly without looking up, "I'll need more of that fencing wire next week. I'm putting up a new section along the east side." He paused. "Maybe 2 coils." Hector looked at him, just for a second. And in that second, Silas held the old man's gaze and gave him a small, deliberate nod. Hector looked back down at the counter. His shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch. The shaking in his hands slowed. Silas picked up his purchases and walked out. That afternoon, he drove to the county seat and found the name of Circuit Judge Everett Vane. He wrote down the address. He said nothing to anyone about what he was planning, because there was no one to say anything to, and because the fewer people who knew, the fewer people Rusk could get to. He went home and fed his cattle. He went back to his ledger. And he started the long, careful, dangerous work of building something that could actually stop a man like Gideon Rusk. Not a bullet, not a brawl, not the kind of confrontation that plays on Rusk's terms, in Rusk's game, where Rusk already holds all the cards. Something harder to fight than a gun. The truth written down, witnessed, and sent to the one man in the territory who had the authority to act on it. But that was still weeks away. First, Silas had to go back to the mercantile. He had to say yes to a woman who'd looked at everything his life was and decided it was enough. He had to stop being the man Red Willow had written off and become something else, something he'd quietly suspected he might be capable of, on the nights when the quiet pressed hardest and the doubt was loudest. He had to decide if he believed one more time that what he'd built had value. He drove back into town the following afternoon. He walked into the mercantile and bought nothing. He stood in the center of the store and looked at Maribel across the room, and he said, clearly enough that Hector could hear, "My answer is yes." Maribel put down the bolt of cloth she was holding. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was steady. Her eyes were steady. She did not collapse with relief or burst into sentiment. She simply said, "Thank you, Silas." And somewhere in those 3 words was something that felt, to a man who had spent 11 years building a life that nobody wanted to be part of, like the first honest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. Hector Serrano gripped the counter with both hands and didn't say anything at all. By sundown, half of Red Willow knew. By midnight, Gideon Rusk knew. And by the following morning, Silas Mercer's cattle had started disappearing. The first cattle disappeared on a Thursday. Silas noticed it the way a man notices everything on land he's worked alone for 11 years, not by counting, not by walking the fence line with a tally book, but by the particular silence of a pasture that should have had more weight to it. He stood at the gate in the early morning and looked out at the south field and felt wrongness before he understood it. 32 animals the night before, he could see maybe 24 from where he stood. He spent the next 2 hours checking every corner of the property, every gap in the fence, every low place where a section of wire might have been lifted or cut. The north fence had been cut, clean, deliberate cuts, not the ragged tier of cattle pushing through under pressure. 3 sections, spaced out, cut low, and laid flat in the grass so you wouldn't see it in the dark. Someone who knew what they were doing, someone who'd done it quiet and unhurried, had walked his fence line in the night and opened it like a door. 8 animals gone. One of them was the heifer he'd sat up with 2 days before. He stood at the cut fence and looked at the ground and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he went back to the house and ate breakfast and thought about what came next. He didn't ride into town. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He would have had to be a particular kind of fool to walk into Rusk's office and report a theft that Rusk had ordered. He didn't tell anyone at all. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down the date, the number of animals missing, the location and nature of the fence cuts, and a rough description of the ground where the wire had been laid flat. He folded the paper and put it in the back of the ledger with the other pages he'd been filling. Then he went and repaired the fence. He worked it carefully, replacing not just the cut sections, but checking every post along that entire northern stretch, reinforcing the weak ones, driving new staples where the old ones had loosened. It took most of the day. His shoulders ached by mid-afternoon, that specific deep ache that lives in the muscle just below the shoulder blade when a man has been working with wire stretchers for too many hours. He didn't stop. He worked until the light went, and then he worked a little longer by lantern because there was one last post that was leaning wrong, and he wanted it right. When he finally came inside, he was too tired to eat much. He sat at the table with a bowl of cold beans and the ledger open in front of him, and he thought about the 8 missing cattle and tried to be honest with himself about what this meant. Rusk was not going to come at him the way most men would come at a man they wanted to destroy. Rusk wasn't stupid. Rusk was, in fact, precisely smart enough to be dangerous, the kind of smart that knows how to use a system against a person, how to make the machinery of law and order grind someone down without ever dirtying his own hands directly. Silas had understood that from the beginning. He'd just underestimated the speed. He'd thought he had more time. He opened the ledger to the blank pages in the back and kept writing. The second disappearance came 5 days later. 6 animals this time, from the east pasture. The fence there hadn't been cut. The gate had been opened and closed again, which meant someone with enough confidence to walk through openly, someone who either knew Silas's patterns well enough to time it or had someone watching the property. He wrote it down. Date, number, method of entry, estimated time based on when he'd last checked the pasture the evening before. He was down to 18 cattle. 2 months ago, he'd had 34. He'd spent 9 years building that herd to where it was. He did the math in his head on the way back from the east pasture and let himself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as it took him to walk from the gate to the porch steps. Then he put it away and sat down and thought about what else he needed to do. He needed more witnesses. He'd already started, but slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook anyone. In the 3 weeks since his conversation with Maribel, he'd made it a habit to stop and talk to people he didn't normally stop for. Not about Rusk, not directly. He'd ask about their fencing, their water rights, their business. He'd mention casually that he'd been keeping good records lately, that it seemed like a smart habit given how things were in the county. And then he'd listen, because the thing about a town that's been kept quiet by fear is that the fear is always sitting right at the surface, and sometimes all a person needs is the sense that someone else might actually be paying attention. Old Pete Halverson, who ran a small grain operation 2 miles east of town, had said something that stuck with Silas. He'd said, "I paid a fine last spring that I don't think I owed. Inspector came out, said my grain storage wasn't up to county code. Showed me papers. I couldn't read all of it, but I paid because what else do you do?" He'd shrugged when he said it. The shrug of a man who's made his peace with something that still bothers him every day. $52, he'd said. I paid it. Silas had written that down too. He visited the widow Elsa Croft, whose late husband had owned a small timber contract up in the hills north of Red Willow. The contract had been rescinded 8 months after her husband's death due to what the county paperwork called administrative irregularities. The timber rights had been reassigned. She'd hired a lawyer, or tried to. The lawyer had taken her retainer, and then told her the case was too complicated and the county too firmly against her. She still had the original contract. She'd shown it to Silas on her kitchen table, smoothing it with her hands the way a woman smooths a document she's looked at too many times, and she'd said, "You tell me what's irregular about that. Because I've read it every week for a year and I can't find it." He wrote that down. He went to see Dario Mendez, who ran the saddle shop on the edge of town and had paid 3 separate business improvement assessments over 2 years, each one showing up without warning in the form of a county notice delivered personally by one of Rusk's deputies. Dario had a family, 5 children. He'd paid every time. You don't argue with a man who can decide whether your business is in violation of something you didn't know was a law, Dario had said, and the bitterness in his voice was old and settled. The bitterness of a man who'd swallowed something he couldn't digest and had learned to carry it anyway. Silas wrote it down. He was building something. He wasn't sure yet if it was enough. But he kept going. The morning after the second cattle disappearance, Maribel came to the mercantile's back door at dawn and knocked twice in the way they'd agreed on. Silas was already there. He'd been in town since before first light, sleeping a few hours in the back of his wagon, rather than making the 3-mile drive in the dark, and then back again. He let her in through the alley, and they stood in the storage room among the flour sacks and the crates of tinned goods, and she looked at his face and said, "How bad?" 14 gone in 8 days, he said. She closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them. "How much does that hurt you?" "Badly enough," he said. "Not enough to stop," she nodded. Then she said, "Rusk came into the store yesterday." He waited. He didn't threaten. That's not how he does it when he wants to send a message. He just browsed, picked things up, put them down. Made conversation with my father about how sad it was that some of the smaller ranching operations in the county were having trouble lately, how he'd heard there were problems with rustling, how difficult it was to investigate when there weren't any witnesses. She paused. He looked at me the whole time he was talking to my father. "Not obviously, just enough. He wanted you to know he's watching," Silas said. "He wanted me to feel it," she said. "There's a difference." There was. The message wasn't information. It was a sensation, designed to settle under the skin and stay there. Silas understood what Rusk was doing. He was trying to make Maribel afraid enough to come to him voluntarily, to decide that Silas was too costly, that surrender was easier than resistance. He was counting on the ordinary human instinct to protect the people you love by giving the threat what it wants. "How's your father?" Silas asked. Maribel looked at the flour sacks for a moment. "He slept last night, which he hasn't been doing. I think your answer saying yes, it gave him something to hold on to." She looked back at Silas. "He's 63 years old and he blames himself for all of this. He thinks if he'd fought back in the beginning instead of paying, it wouldn't have gotten this far." "He's probably right," Silas said, "but he also probably wouldn't have known how to fight it in the beginning, and Rusk knew that when he picked him." Maribel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." "Someone more," she seemed to search for the word, dramatic about it. "Most men, when they're doing something brave, want you to notice they're doing something brave." "I'm not sure I'm doing something brave," he said. "I might just be doing something stubborn. In my experience," she said, "those are usually the same thing." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He left through the alley and drove back to the ranch. On the way home, he passed 2 of Rusk's deputies on horseback, moving slow, watching the road. They didn't stop him. They didn't need to. The watching was the point. He kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the reins and let them look. When he got home, there were tracks in the mud near the barn that hadn't been there when he left. Boot prints, 2 sets, walking the perimeter of the building, stopping at the barn door, moving on. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed, just the tracks, left deliberately, a message in the dirt that said, "We were here while you were gone, and there was nothing you could do about it." He photographed the tracks in his mind. He added them to the ledger. That evening, Silas made a decision he'd been putting off. He drove to the Halverson place. Pete Halverson was sitting on his porch in the last light, and he watched Silas drive up with the careful expression of a man who'd learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. Silas got down from the wagon and walked to the porch and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you decide anything." Pete said, "All right," Silas told him. Not everything, not the full weight of what he was building, but enough. He told him about Maribel's family. He told him what Rusk had asked for. He told him about the cattle disappearing and the fence cuts and the deputies on the road. And then he said, "You told me about that $52 fine." I wrote it down. If you're willing to put your name to that, it's one more piece of what I'm putting together." Pete was quiet for a long time. A bird called somewhere in the fields. His wife appeared in the doorway of the house, looked at Silas, looked at her husband, and went back inside without saying anything. Pete said, "What happens if this doesn't work?" Silas said, "Then Rusk keeps doing what he's doing and nothing changes. And if I put my name to something and it doesn't work, he comes after me." "Yes," Silas said, "he might." Pete rubbed his face with both hands. He was a man of about 60, weathered in the particular way of men who've spent their lives outdoors, skin creased and darkened, hands that looked like they were made of a different material than the rest of him. He said, "My wife's been saying for 2 years that someone should do something. Every time she says it, I tell her it's not that simple." He put his hands on his knees. "She's going to be irritating about this for a very long time." Silas waited. Pete said, "Write down exactly what I told you and bring it back." "I'll sign it." Silas drove home in the dark feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time, something cautious and necessary and dangerous to name too early. He felt like it might actually work. He killed that feeling quickly, because hope that arrives too early is just another way to get blindsided. He wasn't there yet. He was nowhere near there yet. He was a man with a partly filled ledger and a dwindling herd and a false promise of a wedding that hadn't happened, and a sheriff who had 4 deputies in the county's legal machinery behind him. Silas had a pen and the patience to keep using it. But Pete Halverson had said yes, and that mattered. The next 10 days were the hardest of it. 2 more cattle went missing, bringing him down to 16. A county inspector appeared at the ranch, unannounced, a small, officious man with a clipboard who spent 2 hours walking the property looking for violations with the pointed determination of someone who'd been told to find some. He cited Silas for the angle of the barn roof relative to the property line, which was the most bureaucratic act of intimidation Silas had ever witnessed, and he said so, flat and without heat, which seemed to confuse the inspector, who'd clearly expected either anger or capitulation. Silas said, "Write it down. I'll write it down too." The inspector left looking slightly uncertain. Silas wrote it down. He visited Elsa Croft again. This time he brought the language of the county contract code with him, something he'd ridden to the county seat to look up. And he sat at her kitchen table and went through her original timber contract line by line and showed her exactly where the administrative irregularity claim fell apart. She watched him do it with the focused attention of a woman who'd been told she couldn't understand something and had never believed it. When he was done, she said, "So there's nothing wrong with it." "There's nothing wrong with it," he said. She was quiet. Then she said, "My husband would have liked you. Will you sign?" He said. "I'll sign," she said. He went to Dario Mendez on a Saturday morning when the saddle shop was quiet. Dario listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "Give me the paper." He signed it before Silas finished explaining where the signature needed to go. His hand was shaking slightly, but he didn't stop. He pressed the pen down hard, like he wanted to make sure it went all the way through. The ledger was getting heavy. There were 9 names in it now. 9 separate accounts of fines, seizures, threats, and manipulation, each one documented as specifically as Silas could manage, with dates and amounts and the names of the deputies who delivered the notices. Not all of them were strong on their own. Some of them were the kind of thing that a clever lawyer could argue away individually. But together they formed a pattern, and patterns were harder to argue away than individual incidents because patterns revealed intent. Rusk wasn't making mistakes. He was making a system. And Silas was mapping the system. On the 15th day after the first cattle disappeared, one of Rusk's deputies stopped Silas on the main road into town and told him the sheriff wanted a word. The deputy was a young man, maybe 25, with the carefully blank expression of someone who was working hard not to have an opinion about what he was being asked to do. Silas looked at him for a moment and said, "Tell the sheriff I'll stop by the office at 10 tomorrow." The deputy blinked. He'd probably expected an argument or nervousness, or the particular deferential shuffle of a man who's already afraid. Silas gave him none of those things. He held the man's gaze and waited, and eventually the deputy nodded and rode off. Silas went home and didn't sleep much. At 10 the next morning, he walked into the sheriff's office. Rusk was behind his desk. He was a large man, fit in the way of someone who stays fit deliberately rather than from labor, with a face that was almost good-looking in a way that would wear into something hard by the time he was 50. He had a way of sitting that filled more space than the chair required. He looked up when Silas came in and didn't stand, which was a specific kind of message, and he said, "Silas." "Close the door." Silas closed the door and did not sit down. Rusk looked at him for a moment the way a man looks at something he's trying to assess. Then he said, "I've been hearing about a wedding." "News travels," Silas said. "Maribel Serrano is a fine woman," Rusk said. His voice was completely pleasant. "I've always thought highly of her. I'd hate to see her get caught up in somebody else's trouble. She seems capable of deciding what trouble she gets into," Silas said. Rusk smiled. It was a real smile, which was the worst kind. "You're dealing with things above your experience level, son. I say that with respect. You're a rancher, a good one, from what I hear, or you were, before your herd started having problems. That kind of thing can ruin a man if it goes on long enough." He folded his hands on the desk. "Now, I've been wondering if maybe the Serrano family's given you a picture of things that isn't entirely accurate. People in their situation sometimes let their fears color what they're saying. I'd hate for you to be making decisions based on." "I'm not here to negotiate," Silas said. Rusk stopped. Silas said it again quietly, without any heat in it. "I'm not here to negotiate. I came because your deputy said you wanted to talk. We've talked. I'm going to go now." He turned and opened the door. Rusk said behind him, and his voice had lost the pleasantness now, "You should think carefully about what you're walking into, Mercer." Silas said, without turning around, "I have been." He walked out into the morning sun and didn't look back. His hands were not shaking. He noticed that specifically. He'd expected them to be shaking. They weren't. He stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and took one long breath and walked to the mercantile. Maribel was alone in the store. Her father was in the back. She looked up when Silas came in and read his face before he said anything, which was something he was starting to realize she was very good at. "He talked to you," she said. "He tried to," Silas said. "And then I left." He looked at her. "He's going to move faster now. I didn't give him what he wanted from that conversation, and he doesn't like it." "What did he want? To see how scared I was," Silas said. "To see if I could be reasoned with, which in his language means persuaded to walk away." He paused. "He won't try that again. He'll go around it." Maribel set down the book she'd been holding. She said, "How much time do you think we have?" "Not as much as I'd like," he said. "Are you ready to move the wedding up?" She looked at him for a moment. There was something complicated moving through her expression, something he didn't try to read too closely, something that maybe she herself hadn't entirely sorted out yet. Then she said, "How soon?" 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she repeated. "Before he finds a way to manufacture something legal against me," Silas said. "Once I'm formally your husband, the leverage over your father changes. It doesn't disappear, he'll still come after the ranch, but it changes. And I need that change before he moves the next piece." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother's wedding dress is in a trunk upstairs." He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He said, "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. And something in her voice had shifted, some quality he hadn't heard before, something less than armor and more than fragility. I thought you should know it's there, that there's a dress." She stopped. Seemed to collect herself. 2 weeks, she said. "All right?" He nodded. He said, "For what it's worth," and then stopped because he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. He wasn't a man who was practiced at finishing sentences like that. She waited. He said, "You picked the right fight, Maribel. However this goes." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she said, "So did you, Silas." He left before he said something he didn't have the language for. In the 2 weeks that followed, 3 things happened that he hadn't planned for. The first was that word got out about the wedding, and not just the bare fact of it. Somehow, probably through Dario Mendez's wife, who had a gift for information circulation that rivaled the county newspaper word, got out about why the wedding was happening. Not everything, not the full story with the extortion and the ledger and the circuit judge he was still building toward. But enough. Enough that people who'd heard it were talking quietly in their kitchens and their barns and over their back fences about what they'd heard and about their own experiences with certain unexplained finds and about whether there might be something to what the Halverson man had apparently been saying. The second thing was that two more of Rusk's witnesses, a man Silas hadn't talked to yet, a farmer named Cale Briggs, and a young woman who ran a laundry service on the east end of town, appeared at his ranch without being asked. They'd heard, through the Halverson-Mendez pipeline, that someone was writing things down. They came separately, on separate days, and each of them told Silas their story and asked if they could put their name to something. Cale Briggs's hand shook worse than Dario's when he signed, but he pressed the pen down just as hard. The third thing was the worst. Silas was driving back from the Briggs farm on a Tuesday evening when he found the altered brand. It was on a heifer standing in the ditch beside the county road, a quarter-mile from his property line. She was one of his, he knew her markings, the particular white patch on her left haunch that he'd noted when she was born 2 years ago. But someone had worked her brand. His mark had been altered, clumsily but effectively, into something else, something that looked on quick inspection like a brand he'd never used. And tied to her ear was a tag with a number that corresponded, he realized with the sick knowledge of a man who's just seen the trap close, to the county stockyards record system. Someone was going to find that heifer. Someone was going to trace that number. And the papers were going to say she'd been brought in days ago by a rancher who'd claimed he'd purchased her from the name wouldn't be Silas Mercer. The name would be someone else, and the altered brand would make it look like Silas Mercer had taken someone else's cattle and tried to pass them off as his own. He sat in his wagon on the empty road and looked at that heifer for a long time. The sun was going down. The shadows were long. He'd known Rusk would do this. He'd known this was the direction it was heading. That didn't make it less cold to see it sitting in the ditch in front of him, his own animal turned into evidence against him. He drove to the nearest farm, which belonged to a man named Tully Rance, and he knocked on the door and asked Tully to come and look at the heifer with him. He explained what he was seeing. He asked Tully if he'd noticed the animal earlier in the day. Tully said he'd seen two men he didn't recognize moving a couple of head along the road mid-afternoon. He described them. Neither was a name Silas recognized, which meant they were outside help, brought in so none of the local men could be tied to it directly. He wrote it down. He wrote down Tully's account. He wrote down the time and the description of the men and the location of the heifer and the nature of the brand alteration. He drove to the county seat before dark and filed a written notice with the county recorder's office documenting the existence of the altered brand and his identification of the animal, witnessed by Tully Rance. He paid the filing fee out of money he didn't really have. Then he drove home and sat in the dark kitchen for a while. He thought about what it felt like to be methodically dismantled. To watch someone with institutional power take what you'd built, piece by piece, and use it against you. To know that every tool available to a man in your position is either too slow or too visible, or already in the hands of the man trying to destroy you. He thought about the ledger, 11 names in it now. 11 accounts. The altered brand made 12 counts of falsified evidence if he could document it properly. He thought about Circuit Judge Everett Vane, whose name was written on a piece of paper folded in the back of the ledger, whose address in the county seat Silas had confirmed on his last 2 trips there, whom Silas had not yet contacted because he'd been waiting to have enough, to have something that couldn't be easily discredited or minimized or lost in the county machinery. He thought, how much is enough? And he thought, it has to be now. Not in another week, not when he had one more name or one more account. Now. because Rusk was moving faster, and the altered brand was the sign that he was done with the slow pressure and ready for something that would put Silas in actual legal jeopardy, the kind you don't walk out of. He got up from the table. He sat down and wrote a letter. Not a short one, not a hasty one. He wrote it carefully, the way he wrote everything, with the specific dates and the specific amounts and the specific names. Organized so that a man who'd never been to Red Willow could read it and understand exactly what had been happening there, and for how long and to how many people. He listed every name in the ledger. He described the false brand and the county recorder's notice. He described his own cattle losses. He described carefully what had been done to the Serrano family and what Rusk had asked for in exchange for stopping. He put the ledger in a box with the letter. He drove to the county seat before dawn and posted it to Circuit Judge Everett Vane, priority delivery, with a return address that was not his ranch but the county recorder's office, because Rusk would be watching his mail and the recorder's office was neutral ground. Then he drove back to Red Willow. He had a wedding to get ready for. Maribel Serrano married him 9 days later on a Friday morning in the front room of the Mercantile with her father and 2 neighbors as witnesses. She wore her mother's dress, which was cream-colored and slightly too large in the shoulder of hers, and had a small repair along one sleeve that had been done with careful, loving stitches sometime in the past. She'd pinned it in 3 places so it would fit, and it did fit, not perfectly, but honestly the way a thing fits when someone's made the best of what they have. Silas wore his good shirt, which he'd washed and ironed the night before, and his best boots, which were still the boots that had been resoled twice. There was no music. There was no feast. The man who performed the ceremony was a justice of the peace named Harold Finch, a small, nervous man who read the words from a card he'd clearly used many times, and his voice was steady even if his hands weren't. When it was done, Hector Serrano shook Silas's hand with both of his and didn't say anything. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. Maribel looked at Silas afterward and said, "Well." He said, "Well," she said, "I suppose this makes it real." "I suppose it does," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, so only he could hear, "Thank you. I mean it, not for the arrangement, for all of it, for what you're doing." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was, it turned out, exactly the right response. They went back to the ranch that evening, Maribel and her trunk of belongings loaded into his wagon, the sun going down behind the hills. She looked at the weathered ranch house as they pulled up, and she said nothing about it, which Silas appreciated. He'd half expected some comment not cruel, but the kind of instinctive observation people make when something is less than they'd imagined. She made none. She got down from the wagon and started unloading her own trunk, and when he moved to help she let him, and they carried things inside in 2 trips and put them down in the places they would eventually figure out, and that was that. That night, Rusk's men didn't come near the property. Maybe they were regrouping. Maybe they were waiting for instructions. Maybe Rusk was recalculating something, but for one night, the ranch was quiet. For one night, Silas Mercer went to sleep in his house that was no longer empty and listened to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in the next room and felt something he couldn't name and chose not to try. He'd sent the letter. The wedding was done. The ledger was full. Whatever came next was already in motion, moving toward Red Willow from somewhere down the road, and all he could do was make sure he was standing when it arrived. Quiet didn't last. 3 days after the wedding, a deputy named Croft, no relation to Elsa, just the same common name that showed up twice in a county, this size, rode out to the ranch with a folded paper and handed it to Silas without getting down from his horse. Silas unfolded it on the porch while the deputy watched. It was a formal notice of livestock fraud investigation, issued under the county sheriff's authority, citing the altered brand Silas had found in the ditch and the stockyard records that had apparently materialized to support it. The notice said Silas was required to present himself at the sheriff's office within 5 business days to answer questions regarding the matter. Silas read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and said to the deputy, "Thank you." The deputy looked at him the way people kept looking at him lately, with that particular confusion of a man who expected a different reaction and didn't know what to do with the one he got. He rode off without saying anything else. Silas went inside and put the notice in the box with his ledger. Maribel was at the kitchen table when he came in. She'd been going over the mercantile accounts, helping her father with the books, now that she was spending most evenings at the ranch and mornings in town, a back and forth that was tiring but necessary. She looked up at his face and said, "What was that?" He put the notice on the table in front of her. She read it. Her jaw tightened in a way that he was starting to recognize not fear, but the specific anger of someone who sees a dirty move being played, and can't say they're surprised by it. She set it down and said, "The brand you already filed a notice about." "The same one," he said. "He's using your own filing against you," she said. "He's saying what?" "That you filed the notice to get ahead of the investigation." "That's what it'll look like if he controls how it's framed," Silas said. A guilty man who got nervous and tried to document his innocence before anyone started asking questions. She pushed back from the table. She stood up and walked to the window and stood there with her arms crossed, which he'd seen her do before when she was thinking hard. He'd come to understand that it wasn't distance, it was concentration. She wasn't going away from him. She was working. "Has the judge received your letter?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "I sent it priority delivery. If it arrived on time, he's had it for 4 days." 4 days is long enough to read it. 4 days is long enough to read it and decide it isn't his problem, Silas said. "I don't know this man. I know his name and his jurisdiction and that he has the authority to help." "That doesn't mean he will." Maribel turned from the window. Her expression was direct and undecorated. "If he doesn't come, what do we do?" Silas was quiet for a moment. It was the question he'd been sitting with since he mailed the letter, not the question of whether Vane would come, but what happened if he didn't. The livestock fraud notice changed the timeline in a way he hadn't fully calculated. He had 5 days before he was required to appear at the sheriff's office, and appearing without legal protection meant walking into the place where Rusk had the most control and the best ability to manufacture whatever he needed to manufacture. He said, "If Vane doesn't come, I go to the county seat myself and find a lawyer before those 5 days are up. I use the ledger. I file everything I have with the county court directly and make it public record before Rusk can bury it." "That takes money you don't have," she said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "My father has some put aside." "Not much, but some." "I'm not taking your father's money," Silas said. "He's my father, and it's my decision too," she said. The edge in her voice wasn't harsh, but it was definite. "We're married, Silas. That means you don't get to refuse help on my behalf to protect some idea you have about standing on your own." He opened his mouth. She said, "Don't." He closed it. She was right. He knew she was right, and it irritated him, which was itself a useful thing to notice. He said, "We'll hold that as the last option. Give the judge 4 more days." She nodded once. 4 days, she said. She went back to the accounts. He went back to the ledger. Over the next 4 days, Silas did not go into town. He sent Maribel with a short note for Halverson and Dario Mendez and Elsa Croft, delivered through the mercantile's normal business traffic. Just 3 words written in his hand on separate scraps of paper, "Stay ready," signed with the initial S. They would know what it meant, or they wouldn't, and he'd have to trust they'd hold regardless. He couldn't explain more without risking the notes being intercepted, and Rusk's men were watching the mercantile now with the kind of attention that had moved past subtle. He used the 4 days to do something he'd been putting off because it required a particular kind of humility that didn't come naturally to him. He went, one by one, to every person whose name was in his ledger who he hadn't visited recently, not to collect more testimony but to check on them. To make sure they hadn't been pressured since they'd signed. To make sure they still intended to stand. Pete Halverson had a broken window in his grain storage that he said happened when a rock came through it at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago. He couldn't prove who threw it. He wasn't going to not stand. He said so with the particular firmness of a man who's moved past afraid and arrived somewhere quieter and more permanent. His wife stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, but she was watching Silas with an expression he couldn't read, not hostile, but measuring. Dario Mendez had received a visit from the county business assessor, which was either coincidence or was not. The assessor had found no violations and left, but the visit itself was the message. Dario had a bruise along his jaw that he said came from walking into a doorframe in the dark. Silas looked at the bruise and then at Dario and didn't say anything about it. Dario said, "I'm standing." Elsa Croft met him at her gate. She said, "2 men came by yesterday and asked me questions about my late husband's timber contract." They were polite. They were also from the sheriff's office. She paused. I told them I'd referred the matter to a legal representative. She hadn't. She had no legal representative, but she'd said it with the calm confidence of a woman who'd been raised to take up exactly as much space as the situation required. Did that buy us anything? Maybe a few days of confusion, Silas said. Good enough, she said. He got back to the ranch on the 4th evening and found a horse tied at his fence post that he didn't recognize. He stopped the wagon on the track before the gate and sat there and looked at the horse. Bay gelding, well-maintained, decent saddle, not local equipment, not the working gear of a rancher or farmer. It was the kind of horse a man rode when he was traveling a distance and expected to arrive looking like he had resources. The kind of horse someone might ride if they didn't want to arrive in a rented livery animal from the county seat and announce that they'd come from somewhere specific. Silas got down from the wagon carefully. He tied his own horse to a fence post 60 feet down from the bay and walked to the house the long way, coming around the back, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to see what was happening before he was seen. He came around the corner of the house and looked through the kitchen window. Maribel was at the table. Across from her sat a man Silas had never met. 60 or so, with a broad face and gray at his temples, and the particular bearing of a man accustomed to rooms paying attention to him, not arrogant bearing, but settled, the bearing of authority that's been carried long enough to become posture. He was dressed like a traveling merchant, deliberately ordinary, but the clothes were too clean for someone who'd been traveling long, and the hands resting on the table were the hands of a man who worked with paper more than anything physical. They were talking. The man was listening more than speaking, which was, Silas had learned, the mark of someone who already knew what they needed to know and was verifying it. Silas went in through the front door. Both of them looked up. Maribel's face did something careful and controlled. The man at the table simply looked at Silas with the direct, unhurried attention of someone making an assessment. Silas said, "I'm Silas Mercer." The man said, "I know. I've been reading your letter for the past 3 days." He didn't stand, but he extended his hand across the table. Everett Vane. The room was very still for a moment. Silas walked to the table and shook the man's hand and sat down. Vane said, "Your wife has been telling me about the livestock fraud notice." "When did you receive it?" 4 days ago, Silas said. "And you haven't responded yet?" "Not yet." Vane nodded slowly. "Good. Don't." He folded his hands on the table. Up close, his eyes were pale gray and very steady, the eyes of a man who'd heard a great deal of testimony over a great many years and developed the ability to listen without flinching. "I want to be clear with you about what I can and can't do. I'm one circuit judge, and I came here without announcing myself, which means I have no official apparatus here yet. I can't arrest anyone tonight. I can't issue warrants from a kitchen table." He paused. "What I can do is establish that I'm present in this jurisdiction and that I've received evidence of systematic abuse of county authority, which changes what Rusk can do legally. The moment he knows a circuit judge has been contacted and is on the ground, a significant portion of his protection disappears." Silas said, "He doesn't know you're here." "Not yet," Vane said. "He will," Maribel said quietly. Vane looked at her. "Yes," he said, "he will. And when he does, his options narrow considerably. That's the point." He turned back to Silas. "Your ledger." "Do you have it here?" Silas went to the other room and came back with it. He put it on the table. Vane opened it and read the way lawyers and judges read, not absorbing it the way a person reads a story, but scanning structure, checking dates, looking for the architecture of the thing. He turned pages for several minutes without speaking. Maribel poured coffee that nobody asked for. Silas sat with his hands flat on his thighs and waited. Vane said, without looking up, the Croft timber contract. "You have the original document? Elsa Croft has it," Silas said. "I'll need to see it." He kept reading. "The stockyard records for the altered brand you filed a county recorder's notice?" "The 4th day after I found the animal, before the fraud notice was issued." "Yes," Vane looked up then. "That was smart," he said. "Not warmly more the way a man notes a correctly placed beam in a structure he's evaluating." He went back to reading. He read for a long time. Long enough that the coffee went cold and the light in the kitchen changed as the evening settled in. Finally, he closed the ledger and put both hands on the cover and said, "This is sufficient." Maribel let out a breath that she'd probably been holding for an hour. Vane said, "It's not complete. There are gaps in the documentation that a good defense attorney would find." But a pattern of systematic corruption documented across 11 separate victims, with dates, amounts, and signatures, combined with the fabricated brand evidence that you have in the county recorder's office, that's sufficient for me to initiate a formal investigation under circuit jurisdiction. He paused. "Which supersedes county sheriff authority." As Silas said, "He's not going to accept that quietly." "No," Vane said, "he's not, which is why the sequence of events matters. I need to do this publicly and quickly, in an order that doesn't give him time to move pieces before the move is made." He looked at Silas. "I'll need those witnesses present, the people who signed. On a specific day, at a specific time, in a public place." Silas said, "Main Street." Vane considered that. "Public location. Harder for him to control the narrative if there are bystanders." He nodded. "When?" Silas said. "The morning after tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Maribel said, "That's not enough time to—" "It has to be," Silas said. "One more day and he finds out Vane is here. Then he starts moving things and we lose the advantage." He looked at Vane. "Can you be ready?" Vane said, "I'm a circuit judge. My function is to show up prepared." "Yes." That night, after Vane had left to take a room at the boarding house under a name that wasn't his, Silas and Maribel sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The lamp was turned low. Outside, the cattle were quiet. The ranch had that particular stillness that came after full dark, when even the wind settled down. Maribel said, "You need to contact everyone tonight," he said. She said, "I'll go to my father's. It's late. Rusk might have." "I know how to move through this town without being seen," she said. "I've been doing it my whole life." She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. "My father needs to know, and he needs to be there tomorrow. Not just as a witness, he has to be the one who says what Rusk asked for regarding me." Out loud. In public, she stopped. "He'll do it. He'll hate it. But he'll do it." Silas looked at her. He said, "Are you all right?" She seemed slightly surprised by the question. Then she said, "I'm better than I've been in 2 years. She picked up her shawl. "Don't wait up." She went out into the night. Silas sat at the table and wrote 4 notes, one each to Halverson, Mendez, Croft, and Briggs. He described the time and the location. He wrote, "Bring anyone you trust who has a story. Come if you can. Nobody is required." He folded each one and put a name on the outside. Then he saddled his horse in the dark and rode out, not taking the main road, cutting across the open country the way he did when he didn't want to be on a road where someone might be watching. He delivered each note personally. He knocked on each door in the dark and handed the paper through and said nothing more than what was in the note. Halverson said, "We'll be there." Dario took the note and held it with both hands and said nothing but nodded. Elsa Croft read it by lamplight and said, "I'll bring the contract." Cale Briggs was awake. He'd been sitting up, which told Silas that Briggs was the kind of man who didn't sleep well when things were uncertain, and that told Silas something about the courage it had taken Briggs to sign in the first place. He got back to the ranch at 2 in the morning. Maribel was already back, sitting in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. She looked up when he came in. "Father will be there," she said. He cried for about 10 minutes, and then he pulled himself together. She paused. He said to tell you that he'll say whatever needs to be said. Silas sat down across from her. He said, "He's a good man." "He's terrified," she said. "He's going to do it anyway." She looked at her cold cup. "I think that's the definition." They were both quiet for a moment. She said, "Silas, what happens if people don't step forward? What if they come, and they stand there and they watch, and they don't say anything?" It was the question he hadn't let himself dwell on. The honest answer was that it would fail. Vane could read the ledger and initiate proceedings, but without living voices, without people willing to stand up in a public place where Rusk's deputies could see their faces and hear their names. The ledger became a document, and documents could be disputed and delayed and buried in procedural machinery for long enough that Rusk could retaliate against everyone who signed it before a verdict ever came. He said, "Then we do what we can with what we have, and we take it as far as it'll go." She said, "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, "People surprise you. Sometimes they surprise you badly." Sometimes he stopped. He wasn't a man who made speeches, and he wasn't going to manufacture optimism he didn't feel just to make the night easier. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if they'll speak. I know I'm going to be standing on that street tomorrow regardless." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll be beside you." It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was something more like a statement of fact. He found he preferred it that way. The morning of the confrontation arrived the way. Mornings in Texas arrived in late spring, with an immediacy that gave no transition, dark one moment and blazing the next. The sky going from black to pink to a hard, flat blue before a man had time to prepare himself. Silas was up before light, feeding the cattle, checking the water, doing the ordinary work of the ranch the way he did every day because the ordinary work still needed doing regardless of what the day held. There was something steadying about it. The heifer he'd sat up with 3 weeks ago, now recovered and solid, pushed her nose into his hand for salt. He gave her some. He stood there for a minute and let himself be just a man with a cattle ranch and nothing else. Then he went inside and put on his good shirt. He picked up the ledger. He went to the kitchen. Maribel was already dressed. Not in anything ceremonial, a plain dark dress, practical, the kind a woman wore when she intended to stand her ground, rather than look like she was trying to. She had her hair pinned back tightly, and her jaw was set, and she was eating a piece of bread at the table with the mechanical purposefulness of someone fueling themselves rather than enjoying a meal. She looked up and said, "Ready?" He said, "Let's go." They drove into Red Willow together in the wagon, arriving at Main Street at 20 minutes before 9. The street was already more populated than it usually was at that hour, and Silas understood immediately that the word had gone further than just his 4 notes. People were present who had no reason to be there at 9 on a weekday morning, standing in small groups on the boardwalks, talking quietly, watching each other and watching the street with the edged attention of people who'd heard something and didn't know exactly what to expect. Halverson was there, standing with his wife on the south side of the street. Dario Mendez stood near his shop with his eldest son beside him. Elsa Croft had come in her late husband's wagon, wearing black the way she always wore black, and she had the timber contract in a leather folder under her arm. Cale Briggs stood near the front of the mercantile. And there were people whose names weren't in the ledger, people Silas hadn't approached, people who'd heard things through the ordinary channels of community conversation and come to see for themselves. Hector Serrano was standing at the door of his own mercantile. He'd aged badly. In the last 2 years, Silas had noticed his face thinner, his posture less certain than it should have been for a man of his history. But this morning he stood straight. Whatever it had cost him to sleep last night, whatever conversation he'd had with himself in the dark, he'd come out the other side of it, standing straight. He nodded at Silas when he saw him. Silas nodded back. Maribel got down from the wagon and walked to her father and took his arm briefly, not clinging, just a point of contact, brief and certain. Then she came back and stood beside Silas. Somewhere at the back of the small crowd, unhurried, in a plain coat, with no sign that identified him as anything other than an ordinary traveler who'd wandered into something he happened to be curious about, stood Circuit Judge Everett Vane. Silas saw him, their eyes met briefly. Vane gave no sign beyond remaining where he was. Silas pulled out the ledger. He stood in the center of Main Street, and he waited until the street went quiet, which it did, the way a room goes quiet when something is about to happen that everyone can feel approaching. Rusk's deputies were visible, one at the near end of the street, one at the far end, both mounted, watching. The sheriff's office door was closed. The windows were dark. Silas opened the ledger, he said, in a voice that was not large but that carried in the silence the way honest things carried. I'm going to read some names and some dates and some amounts. I'm not asking anyone to do anything. I'm just going to read. He started reading. He read Hector Serrano's name and the first extortion payment and the date. He read the amount. He read the second payment. He kept going, not hurrying, letting each entry land before moving to the next one. The street was absolutely silent. You could hear the horses at the ends of the street shifting their weight. He read Pete Halverson's name and the $52 fine and the date. He read Elsa Croft's name and the timber contract rescission and the date and the amount of the reassigned rights. He read Dario Mendez's name and the 3 business improvement assessments and the dates and the amounts. He kept reading. And then something happened that Rusk had never planned for, had probably genuinely never believed would happen, because a man like Rusk depends for everything on the certainty that people, when faced with consequence, will stay quiet. One person stepped forward, not Halverson, who was expected. Not Dario Mendez, whose name Silas had just read. It was a woman Silas barely knew, a laundrywoman from the east end of town named Vera Tullis, who he'd spoken to exactly once, who hadn't been brave enough before today to sign anything. She stepped off the boardwalk and into the street, and in a voice that shook badly but didn't stop, she said, "He took $40 from me." Said my operation was a sanitation concern. There was nothing wrong with my sanitation. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had a different quality. It was the silence of a collective held breath. Then Pete Halverson walked into the street. He said, "I paid that fine." $52. There was nothing wrong with my grain storage. Then Dario Mendez walked out. He said, 3 payments. 3 years. I want that documented. Then a man Silas didn't know at all. A man he'd never spoken to. A man who'd apparently been standing in the crowd with his own history sitting in his chest for long enough that it had become heavier than his fear. Walked into the street and gave his name and said, "He threatened to condemn my house unless I paid for inspections that were never done." Then another, and then another. Silas kept reading. The sheriff's office door opened. Rusk came out onto the boardwalk. He was dressed and composed, and his hand was close to his gun, and his face was the face of a man who was accustomed to this kind of scene, being stopped before it reached this point, who was recalculating in real time why it hadn't been stopped. Why his deputies were still sitting on their horses and not moving. Why the crowd was not dispersing the way crowds dispersed when you applied the right kind of pressure. He looked at Silas. He said in that smooth, carrying voice, "Mercer, you want to think about what you're doing." Silas looked at him. He said, "I am thinking about what I'm doing," and went back to reading. Rusk stepped off the boardwalk. He walked toward Silas with his shoulders set and his jaw forward, and the particular deliberateness of a man who was used to his proximity being enough to make a situation change. The crowd tightened. People moved back slightly on the boardwalks. A woman near the front pulled her child close. Silas did not step back. He kept reading. Rusk stopped about 8 feet away. His voice came down a register, which was the voice he used when he wanted someone to understand that the pleasantness was over. He said, "This is slander. These are fabricated claims, and I will have you in irons before this afternoon." "Write it down," Silas said. "I'm documenting everything you say." Rusk's face changed then. Something moved through it that Silas couldn't entirely categorize, not fear, Exactly, not yet, but the first awareness of a man who's found the ground is doing something under his feet that it wasn't supposed to be doing. He looked at the crowd. He looked at his deputies. He looked at the people who had stepped into the street. He looked back at Silas. "This ends here," he said. And that was when Hector Serrano walked out of his mercantile door and into the middle of Main Street. He was shaking. His hands were visible from where Silas stood, trembling at his sides. He walked to the center of the street in his 60s and his fear and his worn shoes, and he stood in front of Gideon Rusk and he said, in a voice that cracked on the second word and kept going anyway, "You told me that if I didn't give you my daughter, you'd ruin everything I spent my life building." His voice steadied as he spoke, not because the fear left, but because saying the thing out loud, finally, in daylight, in front of other people, turned it into something with edges he could hold on to. "You told me that to my face, in my own store, in front of my own accounts." He straightened. "I am telling that to every person on this street." Something in the crowd changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that certain kinds of silence change when the thing that was holding them in place is no longer there. Rusk turned to face Hector. He started to say something. A voice from the back of the crowd said, "My name is Everett Vane. I am the circuit court judge for this district, and I am now formally present in this jurisdiction." Vane walked forward through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part when someone moves with the particular confidence of someone who doesn't need to announce what they are, because what they are is visible in how they move. Rusk turned. The color in his face did something Silas watched carefully. It didn't drain, it shifted, the way the color of water shifts when something changes underneath it. Vane said clearly, "To the whole street, I have received sworn documentation of systematic abuse of county authority by the office of sheriff of this county. I am assuming circuit jurisdiction over this matter as of this moment." He looked directly at Rusk. "Sheriff Rusk, I am instructing you to stand down from your duties pending a formal hearing under circuit authority. Your deputies will be notified through proper channels. Any action taken against any citizen present today will be treated as obstruction of circuit court proceedings." Rusk's hand was still near his gun. Silas watched the hand. He watched it the way a man watches something that could go several ways and isn't sure yet which way it's choosing. The street watched it too. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Rusk's hand came away from the gun. He looked at Silas. The smooth pleasantness was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was something older and less composed, something that had probably always been there under the performance of authority and reasonableness. It wasn't quite hatred. It was the expression of a man who has never in his life been genuinely stopped, looking at the face of the person who finally stopped him. He said nothing. Vane said to his deputies, "I'll need both of you to dismount and hand your sidearms to Mr. Halverson for temporary safekeeping while I establish proper authority here." The deputies looked at each other. They looked at Rusk. Rusk was still looking at Silas. After a moment that seemed to take longer than moments usually took, both deputies dismounted. It wasn't over, not yet. Not by a long way. The formal hearing would take weeks. The documentation would need to be properly entered. Lawyers would appear. Arguments would be made. The county machinery, which had run in Rusk's direction for 4 years, would need to be redirected, and that was not a clean or fast process. But Rusk was standing in the middle of Main Street, disarmed by a circuit judge, in front of every person he'd spent 4 years controlling through fear, and the hand that had been near his gun was at his side, and the street full of people who'd been silent for years was not silent anymore. Silas closed the ledger. He didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The ledger had done its work. The people on the street had done theirs. The man from the county seat had come and done his. Maribel put her hand on Silas's arm, not grasping, just resting there, the specific weight of a person who's been standing beside you and wants you to know they're still there. He looked at her. She was watching the street. Her face was composed, and her eyes were bright, and she was not crying. But he thought if she'd been alone, she might have been. He looked back at Rusk. Rusk looked, for the first time since Silas had known of him, like a man without a plan. It was not satisfying the way Silas had thought it might be. It was something quieter than satisfaction. More like the feeling at the end of a long, hard job when you set down the last tool and the work is done and your hands ache and you're not sure quite what to do with yourself now that the thing you've been carrying is no longer yours to carry. He'd spent weeks building this moment, name by name, page by page, in the margins of a ledger he kept on a ranch nobody wanted, with the help of people who'd been afraid long enough to finally want something different. He'd stood on Main Street and read the truth out loud. And the town had answered him. Not all of it. Some people had stayed on the boardwalks. Some had watched and not stepped forward, and would probably feel that for a long time in different ways. Not everyone came through when it mattered, but enough of them had. And enough, it turned out, was all you needed. The deputies handed their sidearms to Pete Halverson, with the stunned compliance of men who hadn't yet processed what had just happened to the world they'd understood that morning. Halverson took the guns with both hands and held them, like he wasn't entirely sure what to do with them, which was honest enough. He was a grain farmer, not a lawman, but he held them steadily and didn't drop them, and that was sufficient. His wife was beside him now, having crossed from the boardwalk into the street at some point during the last few minutes, and she put her hand on his back without saying anything, which was the kind of marital communication that doesn't require words. Rusk stood in the middle of Main Street and did not move. That was the thing Silas noticed most, not the deputies dismounting, not the crowd pressing forward slightly from the boardwalks, not even Vane's measured movement to the center of the street. What Silas noticed was that Rusk had gone absolutely still, in the way that certain men go still when the scenario they're running in their head keeps ending the same wrong way, no matter how many times they run it. He wasn't defeated yet, not formally, not in any way that the law had stamped and recorded. But he was standing in a place he'd never stood before in public, outnumbered, with the authority he'd worn for 4 years suddenly sitting differently on him, like a coat that had fit yesterday, and today had somehow become the wrong size. Vane said, "Sheriff Rusk, I'm asking you to come with me to the county building so we can begin establishing the formal record of this proceeding." Rusk turned his head toward Vane slowly, the way a man turns when he's deciding whether to agree that something is happening or continue pretending it isn't. His voice, when it came, had changed. Not broken. Rusk was too careful for that, too controlled, but the smooth reasonableness was gone, and what was left was flatter and harder, the actual voice underneath the performance. He said, "You have no authority over my office based on a rancher's notebook." Vane said, "The notebook contains 11 documented accounts, signed testimonies, and physical evidence filed with the county recorder. It also contains your name in connection with fraudulent livestock records, which are a matter of circuit court jurisdiction regardless of whether the underlying complaint originates at the county level." He paused. "I also have the testimony of 7 individuals who just spoke publicly on this street, which I am now entering as part of the formal record." "You can dispute the jurisdiction, Sheriff. That's your right. But you'll do it at a formal hearing, not on Main Street." Rusk looked at the crowd. He looked at his deputies standing on the ground without their weapons. He looked at Halverson, holding those 2 guns, like they were something foreign and strange. He looked at the faces on the boardwalks, the people who hadn't stepped into the street, the ones who'd stayed back, watching. He looked at them with the calculating attention of a man who'd spent 4 years reading rooms, measuring fear, identifying who could be moved and who couldn't. What he found in those faces was not what he was looking for. Even the people who hadn't stepped forward, even the ones who'd stayed on the boardwalks out of fear or uncertainty or simple self-preservation, were not looking at him the way they'd looked at him before. The deference was gone, not replaced by hostility, not replaced by courage exactly, but simply gone, the way a spell goes when the thing holding it in place is removed. They were looking at him the way people look at something that used to seem large and has revealed itself to be ordinary. He said to Silas, "One more time. "This isn't finished." Silas said, "No, it'll finish at the hearing." Rusk walked with Vane toward the county building, and two of the townsmen who'd stepped into the street fell in behind them at Vane's quiet request, not as law officers, just as witnesses, bodies in space, the human accountability of a public moment being observed. Rusk walked straight. He didn't shuffle. He didn't look at the ground. Whatever else Gideon Rusk was, he was not a man who collapsed in public, and Silas noted that without admiration, but also without contempt. A man could hold himself upright all the way to his own reckoning. The crowd broke apart slowly, the way crowds do when the central tension has been released, but the energy hasn't fully dispersed yet. People stood in small groups on the boardwalks and in the street, talking in the particular urgent low tones of people, processing something they've just witnessed together. There was a woman crying near the laundry shop, Vera Tullis, the one who'd stepped forward first, the one who'd done it shaking. A man had his arm around her, and she was crying in the way of relief, not grief, the crying that comes when something you've been holding for a very long time is finally set down. Silas stood in the street with the ledger in his hand and felt the strange flatness that comes after sustained effort, the particular empty feeling of a body that has been running on purpose and urgency for weeks and has arrived at the place where the purpose has been delivered and the urgency has nowhere left to go. Maribel said, "Come on." She took his arm and steered him toward the mercantile. Inside, Hector was sitting on the stool behind the counter, with his elbows on the wood and his face in his hands. He was not crying. He was just sitting. When they came in, he lifted his head and looked at Silas with an expression that Silas didn't try to interpret. It was too complicated for a single interpretation, too many things happening in it at once. He said, "Is it done?" "The hearing's not for another few weeks," Silas said. "But the worst of it's done." Hector nodded. He looked at Maribel. She went around the counter and put her hand on his shoulder. He covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a moment, and Silas looked away, not because it made him uncomfortable, but because some things deserved their own space. He set the ledger on the counter. He said, "To Hector, I'll need you to testify formally at the hearing. Everything you told me, everything you told the street." Hector said, "Without moving, I know. It'll be harder than today," Silas said. "Today you had the crowd and the momentum. At the hearing it'll be a room and lawyers and Rusk's people trying to pick apart what you say." Hector lifted his head. He looked at Silas with the particular steadiness of a man who's already paid a price and knows the paying isn't finished. He said, "Silas, I stood in the street and said what I said in front of everyone I've known for 30 years. The hearing is going to be nothing compared to that." He was probably right. What followed the confrontation on Main Street was not clean, and it was not fast, and it was not the kind of thing that resolved itself in the tidy way of stories where the truth wins immediately and everyone goes home satisfied. Real events have friction. They have lawyers and delays and procedural arguments, and the specific misery of watching something obvious get complicated by people whose job it is to complicate obvious things. Vane established his formal presence in Red Willow by filing a circuit court notice with the county clerk the afternoon of the confrontation, which legally suspended Rusk's operational authority pending the outcome of the investigation. One of Rusk's deputies, the younger one, the one with the carefully blank expression who delivered the livestock fraud notice, went to Vane voluntarily the following morning and asked to speak privately. He was in Vane's temporary office for 2 hours. When he came out, he didn't go back to the sheriff's office. Nobody knew exactly what he'd said in there, but Vane's expression afterward was the expression of a man who'd received something useful. Rusk did not go quietly in the way that Silas had cautiously hoped he might. He had a lawyer in from the county seat within 3 days, a man named Aldrich, who wore a good suit and spoke with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent a career finding the procedural gaps in other people's cases. Aldrich filed 2 motions in the first week, one challenging Vane's jurisdiction on a technical point about how the circuit court notice had been filed, and one seeking to have the county recorder's documentation regarding the altered brand excluded from the investigation on the grounds that it had been filed unilaterally without proper notarized witnessing. The first motion failed. The second one cost them 10 days, while Vane reviewed the proper documentation requirements and confirmed that the county recorder's seal was sufficient under circuit court standards. 10 days during which Rusk was technically suspended, but technically still the county sheriff, a legal limbo that everyone found uncomfortable in different ways. Silas used the 10 days carefully. He knew the motion about the brand was a delay tactic. Aldrich didn't expect it to succeed. He expected it to create time and uncertainty were tools in the hands of a man who was counting on witnesses losing their nerve. So Silas went back to every person who'd signed the ledger and every person who'd stepped into the street, and he talked to them, not to pressure them, but to let them know the hearing date and to tell them clearly what to expect. He wanted no one walking into that room without knowing what they were walking into. Pete Halverson's window had been repaired. He didn't mention it, and Silas didn't ask. Halverson said, "My wife thinks you're the best thing that's happened to this county in 10 years. He paused. "I think she might be right, but I don't say that kind of thing out loud because it goes to a man's head." Silas said, noted. Elsa Croft had been to see a lawyer of her own, a woman from the county seat, apparently, which was unusual enough in Red Willow to generate comment. But Elsa had done it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd long since stopped caring what Red Willow thought of her choices. She said, "The lawyer says the timber contract is solid. She says if we can demonstrate that the rescission was connected to Rusk's pattern of coercion rather than any genuine administrative irregularity, I may be able to get the rights restored." She paused. "That's a big if. It's a legitimate if," Silas said. Dario Mendez's bruised jaw had faded. His saddle shop had been busier than usual in the weeks since the confrontation, which Dario attributed to the fact that people liked spending money with someone who'd stood up in the street. "It's probably not a permanent thing," he said. "People's loyalty to principle usually lasts until the next inconvenient thing happens. But I'll take it while it's here." Vera Tullis came to find Silas at the Mercantile one afternoon and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, as though she wasn't entirely sure she had the right to take up space there. She was a small woman, older than she probably looked, with hands permanently reddened from her work. She said, "I just wanted to say, that morning I'd told myself I wasn't going to." She stopped. "I'd told my sister the night before that I was going to watch and go home, and that was all I was going to do." Silas said, "What changed?" She thought about it. She said, "You were just reading. You weren't making speeches. You were just reading what was true. And I thought if that man can stand in the street and just tell the truth, I should be able to stand there and tell mine." He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Thank you." For stepping forward, she looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to testify at the hearing," and left. Maribel was in the doorway between the front of the Mercantile and the back room. She'd heard the conversation. She didn't say anything about it, just looked at Silas with an expression he was starting to be able to read something that was not quite approval, which would have implied surprise, but closer to confirmation. Like she was collecting evidence for a conclusion she'd already reached. The formal hearing took place on a Wednesday, 3 weeks, and 2 days after the confrontation on Main Street. It was held in the county building in a room that was too small for everyone who wanted to attend, and Vane's clerk spent 40 minutes before the proceedings began trying to manage the crowd of people who showed up, some to testify, some simply because they felt the right to witness what happened to the man who'd run their county. Rusk sat at the defendant's table in the same good coat he wore everywhere, with Aldrich beside him. He looked composed. He looked like a man preparing to contest every single point, which was exactly what he intended to do. Silas had expected that. He'd told everyone who was testifying to expect it too. Silas sat with the ledger on the table in front of him, and a young woman beside him named Clara Gaines, who was not technically a lawyer, but had spent 3 years as a court clerk at the circuit level and understood the procedural mechanics of a formal hearing well enough to guide him through it. It was not ideal, it was what they had. Vane opened the proceeding with the formal reading of the circuit court's jurisdiction and the list of charges being investigated, which Aldrich immediately contested on two grounds that Vane overruled in the time it took most people in the room to understand the objections. Aldrich was good. Vane was better. Aldrich knew more about procedural angles. Vane knew more about which angles mattered and which ones were furniture. Hector Serrano testified first. He took the chair across from Vane's table, and he sat with his hands flat on his thighs, and he told the story in the order it had happened. Starting with Rusk's first visit to the Mercantile after closing time, and ending with the ultimatum about Maribel. He spoke clearly and without embellishment. When Aldrich cross-examined him, pressing on whether the first payment had been voluntary, whether Hector had ever formally protested the county's licensing review, whether he could produce witnesses to any of the conversations he described. Hector answered each question with the patience of a man who'd anticipated being disbelieved and had decided to let the disbelief pass through him rather than argue with it. He said, at one point, when Aldrich suggested his account was colored by his close relationship to the man now married to his daughter, "My daughter married Silas Mercer 3 weeks ago. She decided to do that before I told her the full extent of what Rusk had threatened. She did it on her own terms, for her own reasons, and nobody asked me what I thought about it." He paused. "I'm telling you what happened to my business and to my family because it happened. Not because of who my son-in-law is." Aldrich moved on. Pete Halverson testified. He was brief, factual, and inflexible under cross-examination. When Aldrich suggested the $52 fine might have been a legitimate county assessment, Halverson said, "I asked the inspector to show me the specific code violation in writing. He couldn't. I paid anyway because I was afraid not to." He said it simply, without self-consciousness, the statement of a man who decided that the embarrassment of admitting fear was less important than the truth of the matter. Dario Mendez testified. He described the 3 payments and the deputy who delivered each notice and the specific language used in each conversation. Aldrich spent a long time on Dario's inability to produce receipts for the payments, which had been made in cash at the sheriff's office with no formal documentation. Dario said, "I know, I didn't get receipts. He knew I wouldn't get receipts." That was the point. He looked at Rusk directly when he said it, which was the only moment during his testimony that he looked at anyone other than Vane. Rusk looked back without expression. Elsa Croft laid the timber contract on Vane's table and walked through it section by section with the precision of a woman who'd read it too many times to be uncertain about any of it. The lawyer she'd hired sat in the gallery and nodded at intervals. Aldrich challenged the relevance of the timber contract to the criminal corruption charges, and Vane allowed it as pattern evidence, which meant it stayed in the record. Vera Tullis testified in a voice that was steadier than the one she'd used on Main Street, as though she'd spent the 3 weeks preparing herself for exactly this room. She looked small in the chair. She testified anyway. Cale Briggs testified. His hands shook throughout. He got through it. 4 more people testified who weren't in the original ledger, people who'd either been in the crowd on Main Street and come forward afterward, or who'd heard through the community's communication channels that there was a formal hearing and that testimony was being accepted and had decided this was their moment. One of them was the young deputy who'd spoken privately with Vane the morning after the confrontation. His testimony was delivered in the careful, precise language of someone who'd thought very hard about what he could and couldn't say and where the lines were, but what he said specific conversations he'd witnessed, specific instructions he'd been given regarding Silas's cattle, and the altered brand was enough to make Aldrich visibly reconsider 3 positions he'd been preparing to argue. Rusk testified in his own defense. He was, Silas had to acknowledge, very good at it. He characterized every payment as a legitimate administrative interaction. He describes the livestock fraud notice as a routine response to an anomaly in county stockyard records. He described his conversations with Hector as professional exchanges about the business licensing review, during which Mr. Serrano had apparently misunderstood the nature of the process. He described his invitation for Maribel to attend social functions as ordinary neighborly courtesy that had been misinterpreted by a family under stress. He was composed and specific, and his language was always just technical enough to create ambiguity where the witnesses had spoken plainly. Aldrich had built him well for this. Silas watched it and felt the specific discomfort of watching someone be effectively dishonest in a formal setting where the mechanism for stopping it was slow and imperfect. But then Vane asked Rusk about the deputy's testimony regarding specific instructions about the Mercer cattle. Rusk said he had no memory of those instructions. Vane said, the deputy described a specific conversation in the sheriff's office on the evening of the 14th. He described the words used and the names of 2 individuals contracted to move the cattle. Do you recall the conversation or not? Rusk said, I speak with many people in the course of my duties. Vane said, that's not an answer to my question, Sheriff. Rusk said, I don't recall that specific conversation. Vane looked at him for a moment with those pale gray eyes that didn't flinch. Then he said, the 2 individuals named by the deputy as the contractors, their names appear in the stockyard ledger as parties to a transaction registered 3 days after the date of that conversation. The stockyard ledger is county property and was subpoenaed as part of this proceeding. Would you like to revise your answer? The room was very quiet. Aldrich leaned to Rusk and spoke in his ear. Rusk listened without changing his expression. Then he said, on advice of counsel, I'd like to address that documentation separately. You'll have the opportunity, Vane said. He moved to the next question. But the damage was done, and everyone in the room knew it, and Rusk knew they knew it. And the composed surface he'd maintained through the entire proceeding had developed something underneath it that hadn't been there before, a subtle wrongness in the way he held his jaw, a stillness that was slightly too effortful to be natural. After the testimonies, Vane took a recess of 2 days to review the full record before issuing his findings. 2 days during which Red Willow was simultaneously the most and least talkative it had been in years. People who'd sat silent through all of it found opinions. People who'd already spoken had second thoughts and third thoughts, and the general uncomfortable repositioning that happens when a community looks at what it's been and has to decide what it intends to be instead. Silas went home both evenings and worked the ranch. Not because there was anything particularly urgent. He'd fallen behind on maintenance during the weeks of preparation and testimony, and the work had accumulated, but none of it was emergency work. He did it because doing it helped him stay in his body rather than in his head, where the waiting had a tendency to become circular. Maribel came home each evening from a day divided between the mercantile and her own thoughts, and they ate dinner and talked about the hearing, and didn't talk about it and went to sleep and did it again. On the second evening she said, "My father seems lighter." Silas said, "He is lighter. He's been carrying that thing for 2 years. He keeps saying he should have fought sooner." She was quiet for a moment. I told him that Rusk chose him specifically because he'd built something worth protecting. That's not a weakness. That's what looked for people who had something to lose. Silas said, "That's true," she said. "I know it is." She moved food around her plate. "I just hope he actually believes it. The thing about understanding the truth of something and believing it in the place where it actually hurts was a problem Silas knew something about." He said, "It takes a while." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" He said, "I spent 11 years thinking this ranch wasn't worth anything because nobody else saw value in it." She was quiet. He said, "It was worth exactly what I thought it was worth." "I was just asking the wrong people." She set down her fork. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something that had been building in it over the weeks they'd lived in this house together. Something that had started as assessment and moved through respect and arrived somewhere less categorizable. She said, "You should stop assuming the worst about what you've built." He said, "I'm working on it." She picked her fork back up. "Good," she said, and ate her dinner. Vane's findings came on a Thursday morning, issued formally from the county building in a document that Silas and Maribel and Hector read together in the back room of the mercantile. Clara Gaines, who'd helped Silas through the hearing, had obtained a copy before most of the town and brought it directly. The findings determined that sufficient evidence existed to sustain charges of systematic abuse of county authority, fraudulent assessment of civil penalties without proper documentation, interference with the county court record through falsification of livestock documentation, and coercive conduct towards civilian residents of the county, including specific conduct constituting criminal extortion in the matter of the Serrano family. Rusk was formally removed from the office of county sheriff pending criminal prosecution under circuit court authority. His badge, his office, and the operational authority of the sheriff's department were transferred to the county clerk's office to be administered through a temporary appointment until a formal election could be organized. The two contracted men named in the deputy's testimony were identified, and a warrant issued for their questioning regarding the altered brand and the cattle disappearances. Recovery of the stolen cattle from Silas's herd was authorized through the county stockyard records. Elsa Croft's timber contract rescission was flagged for separate review. The fraudulent business assessments levied against Dario Mendez, Pete Halverson, and 6 other individuals were formally identified as lacking proper county authority and subject to restitution proceedings. Hector read the section about the extortion finding twice. Then he folded the document along its creases very carefully, the way he folded things he wanted to keep, and he held it in both hands and breathed. Maribel put her hand on her father's arm. She didn't say anything. Silas looked at the folded document in Hector's hands and felt something settle in him that had been tense for a very long time. Not satisfaction exactly, there was still the criminal prosecution ahead, still the restitution proceedings, still the long administrative business of correcting what 4 years of corruption had built. There was no clean ending, just a change in direction, which was all you could ask for and more than most people got. He'd brought Rusk's name into the county court record, with evidence sufficient for a circuit judge to act on. He'd gotten 11 people, eventually more, to put their names on paper, and then stand behind those names in a public room where it cost them something real. He'd done it without a gun, without a fight, without giving Rusk the confrontation he could have controlled. He'd done it with a pen and a battered ledger, and the patience to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. Rusk was arrested the same afternoon the findings were issued, formally, by the county clerk and 2 men deputized for the purpose, ordinary men, not career lawmen, which was its own kind of statement about what had just changed. He was escorted to the sheriff's office, where he had spent 4 years frightening people, and he was locked in the cell at the back, the same cell where witnesses had been intimidated, where pressure had been applied, where the machinery of his corruption had been headquartered. He didn't go loudly. He didn't make a scene. He walked into that cell the way he'd walked everywhere, straight, composed, in control of his external presentation. The door locked behind him. Silas wasn't there to see it. He didn't need to be. He was at the county stockyard when the warrant was being executed, going through the records with a stockyard clerk, identifying the animals that had been taken from his ranch, one by one, by the markings he knew the way he knew his own handwriting. It was slow work, methodical, the kind of work that didn't have drama in it, just the careful reassembly of what had been taken piece by piece. He found 16 of his 18 missing animals in the stockyard records. 2 were unaccounted for, either sold on or moved somewhere the records didn't capture. He noted that. He signed the recovery documentation. He arranged for the animals to be returned to his ranch. When he drove home that evening, the wagon was empty. The cattle would come separately, moved by the stockyard's men. But driving home on that road felt different than it had in a long time. Not because anything about the road had changed. The road was the same road, rutted and long and hard on the wheels. The land on either side of it was the same land, dry grass and cedar, and the particular flat endlessness of that part of Texas. But the weight Silas had been driving under was gone, and the absence of it changed how everything else felt. He pulled into his property and unhitched the horse and fed the remaining cattle and went inside. He washed his hands and face at the basin. He looked at himself in the mirror above it, which he rarely did. He wasn't a vain man, and he was also not particularly interested in what he looked like, and he stood there for a moment and looked at the face of a man who'd done something that had mattered and was going to have to figure out what came after that. Maribel came in from town an hour later. She put her bag down and went to the stove and checked the pot he'd put on before she arrived. She said, "The stockyard? 16 recovered," he said. "And the other 2 gone," he said. "I'll write it off." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "But 16 is better than none." She turned from the stove. She looked at him across the kitchen, and there was something in her face that had been shifting gradually over the past weeks. Something that had moved through the phases of a complicated feeling, slowly enough that neither of them had made an event of it. The way certain real things happen, not suddenly, not dramatically, but incrementally, each day adding something small until the accumulation was large enough to notice. She said, "How are you?" It was such a simple question that he didn't have an immediate answer for it, which was itself an answer. He said, "Tired." She said, "Yes." He said, "Something else, too." "Something I don't have a word for." She nodded slowly. She said, "I know what you mean." She went back to the stove. "Sit down. The food's almost ready." He sat down. He put the ledger on the table. He opened it to the last page with writing on it, looked at it for a moment, then closed it and put it to the side. He didn't need it anymore. That part was done. The county would need to appoint a temporary sheriff. The criminal prosecution would move through the circuit court over the coming months. The restitution proceedings would be slow and imperfect, and some people would get less than they deserved, and some would wait longer than was right, because that was how those things went. Elsa Croft's timber rights were not guaranteed, and her fight was not over. The altered brand had broken Rusk's narrative in the hearing, but the legal costs of the proceeding had taken money. Silas didn't have a way to recover quickly. None of it was finished. It was just changed. Outside, in the far pasture, the remaining cattle moved in the last of the evening light, and the sound of them, that particular low, settled movement of animals that are fed and watered and where they're supposed to be, came through the window and filled the kitchen, and was ordinary, and it was enough. Maribel put 2 bowls on the table and sat across from him. They ate dinner in the crooked ranch house that she'd moved into without complaining, in the county that was learning, slowly and with difficulty, what it felt like to be something other than afraid. And for one evening, that was all there was and all there needed to be. The weeks after Rusk's arrest had their own particular texture, different from anything that had come before. The urgency was gone. The thing that had been driving Silas forward the ledger, the witnesses, the letter to Vane, the constant low-grade calculation of what came next and how to do it without being destroyed. First, all of that had served its purpose and now sat quiet. The way tools sit quiet when the job is done and they've been put back on the shelf. He'd wake in the mornings and lie there for a moment and wait for the familiar weight of it to settle on his chest. And when it didn't come, he'd have to remember why. And remembering felt strange. Like stepping onto ground you've been told is solid, but haven't trusted yet. He worked the ranch. The 16 recovered cattle came back in 2 groups, moved by the stockyards men on a Tuesday and a Thursday. And he stood at the gate each time and counted them in with the specific satisfaction of a man reclaiming something that had been taken through dishonesty. The heifer with the white patch on her left haunch came in the first group, and she walked through his gate with the complete indifference of an animal who had no idea what her disappearance had meant or what it had cost. He scratched her between the ears anyway. The 2 unaccounted-for animals never came back. He wrote them off, as he'd told Maribel he would, with the same careful handwriting he'd used in the ledger, a short entry in his expense records that acknowledged the loss, and closed it. Some things you recovered, and some things you didn't. The accounting had to reflect that. He repaired the north fence properly for the first time, not just the cut sections, not just the emergency patches he'd put up in the weeks of crisis, but the whole stretch, post by post, wire by wire, the kind of repair that would hold for years rather than months. It took him 3 days, and his hands were cut up by the time he finished, the small, unavoidable cuts that come from handling wire-stretched taut, and he looked at his hands in the evening and thought that this was the kind of damage he didn't mind. This kind he'd chosen. Maribel had been absorbed in the mercantile accounts since Rusk's removal, working with her father to assess the actual financial damage of 2 years of extortion payments and calculate what the restitution proceedings might realistically return. The numbers were not encouraging. The restitution process was real. Vane had established it formally, and it was moving through the circuit court, but moving through the circuit court meant moving at the speed of the circuit court, which was to say slowly, with paperwork, through channels that had their own friction and their own way of reducing things. She came home one evening with the account books under her arm and put them on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at them the way you look at something you've been looking at too long and need to stop looking at for a moment. Silas put coffee in front of her. He sat across from her. He said, "How bad? Not as bad as it could be," she said. "Better than I was afraid it was." She opened the top book to a page she'd marked. The extortion payments over 2 years totaled $240. That's what we documented. There may have been earlier, smaller ones that weren't recorded as clearly. She ran her finger along a column. The restitution order covers that amount in full, which sounds good until you understand that the county has to actually collect it from Rusk's assets, which are being assessed and contested by Aldrich as part of the criminal proceeding. "So it's real, but it's slow," Silas said. "It's real, but it could be 2 years before we see most of it," she said. "And the business lost customers during that period because my father was too stressed and distracted to run it well, and that loss isn't in the restitution order because you can't quantify distraction." She closed the book. "We'll manage. The store is still standing. Father is still standing." "We'll manage," Silas said. "Is there anything that would help in the short term?" She looked at him. "What do you mean? I mean, is there a way I can help the mercantile's cash position while the restitution works itself out?" She said carefully, "Silas, this isn't your debt." "No," he said, "but you're my wife, and that's your father's business. And if there's something I can do to keep it from being squeezed in the short term while the courts are doing what courts do, I want to know what it is." She was quiet for a moment. She was doing the thing she did when she was being honest with herself about something she'd rather not look at directly, looking at the table rather than at him, thinking through it with the thorough attention she gave everything. Then she said, "If the store can carry through the next 6 months without a major expense, it'll be all right. Father's been holding off on re-roofing the storage building because the estimate was significant. If that roof goes in a hard rain, it damages the inventory." Silas said, "I can do the roof." She looked up. "Not all at once," he said. "Weekends. I'm not a professional roofer, but it's not complicated work. I've re-roofed the barn twice." She said, "You've been working your own repairs." "The fencing's done," he said. "The cattle are back. The ranch isn't going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment with that particular expression he'd come to know, the one that wasn't gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied surprise and she'd moved past that. But something more like the quiet recognition of a person who is realizing, incrementally, that the thing they chose is turning out to be more than they had proof of when they chose it. She said, "We'd have to do it on Saturdays. Father and I both know the roof well enough to help." He said, "Saturday, then." She said, "All right," and opened the account book again and went back to work. The restitution proceedings ground forward through the spring with the dependable impersonality of legal machinery. Aldrich contested the asset assessments, which everyone expected. The criminal prosecution moved on its own parallel track, slower than the civil proceeding, with dates pushed back twice due to procedural filings that Silas didn't entirely understand, but that Clara Gaines explained to him as Aldrich buying time in the hope that something would change. Nothing changed. The deputy who testified his name was Arlo Pitts, and Silas had never known his first name until the hearing cooperated fully with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge on his own conduct. which was the kind of imperfect outcome that real justice produced and that everyone involved had to make their peace with. Arlo Pitts came to find Silas at the ranch one afternoon in early spring. He stood at the porch steps in plain clothes. He hadn't worn a deputy's uniform since the day of the confrontation, and he said, "I know I'm not someone you have reason to want to talk to." Silas said, "Come up on the porch." Pitts came up and sat in the second chair, the one Maribel usually used in the evenings. He was younger than Silas had realized when he'd been in uniform, maybe 22 or 23, with the specific look of someone who'd made a mistake large enough to age his face past his years. He said, "I want you to know I didn't know what the brand alteration was for when I was told to arrange it. I knew it was wrong. That's not the same as not knowing." Silas said, "No. I told myself it was above my pay grade to ask questions," Pitts said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. I knew it was wrong, and I told myself it wasn't my business to know why." He looked at his hands. "I'd been doing that for 2 years, telling myself things that were wrong weren't my business." Silas was quiet for a moment. He said, "What are you going to do now?" Pitts said, "I don't know yet. I can't be a lawman in this county, probably not anywhere. I've been thinking about going north, starting somewhere that doesn't know my name." He paused. "I just wanted to say what I said, to your face." Silas looked at him. He said, "You testified when it mattered. That's not nothing." "It's not enough," Pitts said. "No," Silas said, "probably not. But it's what you did, and it was part of what put Rusk where he is." He leaned back in his chair. "What you do next is a different question from what you did. You get to decide one of those." Pitts sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up and put his hat on and said, "Thank you for letting me say what I needed to say." He walked off down the track, and Silas watched him go and felt the complicated texture of a thing that was neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but something in between. The realistic assessment of a person who'd done wrong and was trying to figure out what came after, which was all any of them were doing in different degrees. Maribel was in the barn when Pitts left. She came out and saw Silas watching the empty track and said, "Who was that?" "Pitts," Silas said, "the deputy." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did he want?" "To apologize, I think," Silas said. "Or to say something he needed to say, out loud to someone who was actually there." "Did it help?" she asked. "Him, maybe," Silas said. "I don't know. People need to say things sometimes, even when the saying doesn't fix anything." She nodded. She went back inside. The roof on the Mercantile's storage building took 4 Saturdays. Silas drove into town each week with lumber and tools in the wagon, and he and Hector and Maribel worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Silas doing the work that required height and experience, Hector handing materials and holding things steady with hands that shook less than they had in February. Maribel doing everything with the practical competence of a woman who didn't differentiate between things she was supposed to be able to do and things she wasn't. The second Saturday, it rained for an hour in the morning, which was inconvenient, and they worked through it because they had the old section stripped and couldn't leave it open. By noon, they were soaked, and the new section was on and holding, and they sat on the tailgate of Silas's wagon eating bread and cold chicken in damp clothes, and Hector said, unprompted, "I didn't like you at first." Silas looked at him. Hector said, when Maribel told me what she'd decided, "I thought she'd lost her mind. No offense. None taken," Silas said. "I thought she was making a practical calculation, and practical calculations about marriage always cost someone something," Hector said. He bit into his bread. "I was right about the practical calculation. I was wrong about the cost." Silas didn't say anything. Hector said, "You're a good man. I didn't know that when she decided." She did. He shrugged, which was the gesture of a man acknowledging a thing he couldn't entirely explain. "She's usually right about people. It's irritating," Maribel said. From the other end of the tailgate, without looking up from her food, "I can hear you." Hector said, "I know." He kept eating. Silas looked out at the street from the alley behind the Mercantile, at the ordinary Saturday traffic of Red Willow going about its ordinary business, the wagons, the people on the boardwalks. The children running between the buildings on whatever incomprehensible errands children ran. The town looked like itself. It looked like the town it had always been, unremarkable from the outside, the same weathered buildings and the same flat Texas sky. But something in it had changed. He couldn't point to it exactly. It wasn't that people were more cheerful or more open, or that the streets had somehow transformed. It was something subtler, something in the way people moved through public space, something in the quality of the interactions he observed. Less watchfulness, less of that particular careful calculation that people do when they're in an environment where the wrong word or the wrong association can cost them. The town wasn't free of its own problems, it never would be, because towns were made of people and people were complicated, but the specific fear that had organized it for 4 years was gone. And the absence of that specific fear had created a kind of space that hadn't been there before. Space for ordinary things. Space for ordinary people to be ordinary without it costing them. He thought about what Vera Tullis had said, that she stepped forward because he was just reading. Just telling the truth in a plain voice. He'd thought about that a lot in the weeks since. About how the thing that made it possible for people to speak wasn't a rousing speech or a dramatic moment or a hero who was obviously more capable than everyone else. It was just someone doing the straightforward, unglamorous work of paying attention and writing it down, and being willing to stand somewhere visible with it. He was not a hero. He knew that. He was a man who'd been lonely enough and stubborn enough and angry enough in the right proportions at the right time to do something that needed doing. He'd made mistakes. He'd misjudged the timeline at least twice. He'd underestimated how fast Rusk would move after the wedding, and it had cost him 16 cattle and 3 weeks of genuine jeopardy. If Arlo Pitts hadn't testified, the brand alteration evidence would have been significantly harder to anchor in the formal record. If Vane had been a different kind of man, slower, more cautious, unwilling to come down without official backing, the whole architecture of what Silas had built might have fallen apart at the critical moment. Things had worked, not because they were inevitable. Because enough people had done enough things right at enough moments that the cumulative effect had been sufficient. He didn't know how to feel about that except honest. He thought sometimes about Catherine, the woman who'd told him gently and not inaccurately that his life didn't have enough to offer. He didn't think about her with bitterness. He'd processed past that years ago. But he thought about what she'd said, that a man who didn't know how to want things for himself couldn't give someone what they needed, and he thought about whether that was still true. Whether he'd changed it, whether the thing that had happened over the past months had been about wanting something for himself or wanting something for other people, and whether the distinction mattered. He thought, maybe you don't have to know what you want for yourself before you can do something worth doing. Maybe the wanting comes after. Maybe you do the hard thing first and figure out what it meant to you later, when you're sitting on a tailgate in wet clothes and an old man is telling you he misjudged you, and your wife is pretending not to listen from 4 feet away. The formal sentencing in Rusk's criminal case came in late spring, 6 weeks after the restitution proceedings were finalized. Rusk was convicted on 4 counts: systematic abuse of county authority, fraudulent civil assessment, criminal extortion in the matter of the Serrano family, and conspiracy to fabricate evidence in the Mercer livestock fraud case. The sentencing was handled by Vane, who had continued to travel to Red Willow through the proceedings with the steady commitment of a man who'd taken something on and intended to see it through. He sentenced Rusk to 6 years in the territorial prison and ordered him permanently removed from any position of public authority in the circuit. Aldrich appealed 2 of the 4 counts. The appeals took 8 months and both failed. Silas was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. He'd been present for every day of the formal hearing, but he didn't go to the sentencing, and when Maribel asked why, he said, "Because I don't need to watch it. It's not mine to watch." She'd looked at him for a moment and then nodded like she understood something she hadn't quite put into words before. What he did instead was drive to the Halverson place and tell Pete the news. Then to Dario Mendez's saddle shop, then to Elsa Croft's farm on the North Road. He went in person because these were the people it mattered to most, and they'd earned the right to hear it from someone who'd been there from the beginning rather than reading it in a county notice. Pete Halverson sat on his porch and looked at the fields for a moment. Then he said, 6 years, 6 years, Silas said. Pete said, is that enough? Silas said, it's what the law gave us. Pete was quiet. Then he said, it's more than nothing. 4 years ago, you couldn't have told me we'd get more than nothing. He rubbed his face. I'll take more than nothing. His wife appeared in the doorway of the house. Pete said, without turning 6 years, she said, good. Then she went back inside. Dario Mendez closed up the saddle shop for an hour in the middle of the day when Silas told him, which was unlike him, and he sat with Silas at the small table he kept for customer discussions, and he said, my oldest boy, he's 15, he told me last month that he wanted to learn the saddle trade. Wanted to take it over one day. He looked at his hands. A year ago, I was trying to figure out how to tell him to learn something else, to go somewhere the business wasn't going to be taken from him. He stopped. I don't have to tell him that now, Silas said, no. That's worth more than 6 years, Dario said. That's worth more than any sentence. Elsa Croft received the news standing at her gate in the particular upright way she received everything. She said, and the timber contract? The review came back, Silas said. The original rescission has been vacated. The contract rights revert to you. He paused. Your lawyer will need to file the formal claim, but Vane's written it into the civil record. Elsa's face did something careful. Her hand tightened on the gatepost. She said, my husband's contract, yes. She looked at the road beyond Silas's wagon for a long moment. Then she said, he worked on that contract for 3 years before he got it approved. He was so proud. She stopped, collected herself with the visible effort of a woman who was not going to cry on a public road if she could help it. It won't bring the years back. No, Silas said. It won't. She nodded. She said, thank you for coming to tell me yourself. He drove home with the particular tiredness of a day spent delivering news that mattered not the tiredness of hard physical work, which he preferred, but the tiredness of emotional weight carried through a series of conversations where you had to stay present and let the other person feel what they needed to feel without trying to move it along. When he got back to the ranch, Maribel was on the porch. She'd been in town most of the day and had apparently arrived home not long before he had. She had her shawl and a cup, and she was watching the western sky where the sun was going down in that extravagant Texas way, orange and pink bleeding into purple at the edges, the kind of sky that had nothing subtle about it. She looked at him when he pulled up. She said, how are they? Halverson's taking it in, he said. Dario cried a little. Elsa held herself together through sheer will. He got down from the wagon. All of them asked about things that were still unfinished. The restitution timeline. What happens to the deputies? Whether the county appointment process for the new sheriff is going to be transparent, or whether the old machinery just plugs in someone new. Good question, she said. All of them, he said. None of them with easy answers. He tied the horse and came up onto the porch and sat in his chair. She handed him her cup without being asked, and he took it and drank and handed it back. They sat for a moment in the shared quiet of two people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it, trying to work out what normal looked like from here. She said, the town council is meeting next week to discuss the sheriff appointment process. Halverson and Dario have both been asked to participate in the oversight committee. She paused. Halverson's wife apparently volunteered him before he could say no. Silas said, good, he'll do it right. He'll complain about it constantly, Maribel said. Yes, Silas said, and he'll do it right. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that happened before she could stop it, the unguarded kind. He'd been seeing more of those lately, he said. There's a wedding. She looked at him. He said, someone told me there's a wedding planned. About 3 weeks from now, I'm told I'm expected to attend. She looked at him with the particular expression she used when he was being dry about something, and she hadn't quite decided whether to respond to it or not. She said, who told you that? You, he said, about 4 days ago. You said Halverson's daughter is getting married and that you'd accepted an invitation on both our behalfs. You were there when I said it, she said. I know, he said. I'm saying it back to you because I think it's good. She turned back to the sky. It is good, she said. He and his wife came to see me after the sentencing was announced. They wanted to make sure we were coming. She was quiet for a moment. She said Halverson's wife said that she'd prayed for someone to do something about Frusk for 2 years. And then when it happened, she realized that if she'd found the courage to say what she knew sooner, maybe it would have happened sooner. Silas said, What did you tell her? I told her that looking backward at what we didn't do is a good way to miss what we can still do. She paused. I'm not sure that was the right thing to say. It was honest, he said. Honest and right aren't always the same. No, he said. But they're closer than dishonest and comfortable. She considered that. Then she said, I'm going to keep thinking about what I should have said. I know, he said, you will. She looked at him. That's not a criticism? No, he said. It's just who you are. You think about things until you've gotten them right. It's one of the things that makes you. He stopped. She waited. He said, Good at what you do. She looked at him for a moment with something that was amused and also slightly exasperated, and also something else he still didn't have a precise word for. She said, That's not what you were going to say. He said, No. She said, Are you going to say what you were going to say? He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who'd spent 11 years not saying things because there had been no one to say them to, and the habit of silence was deep and didn't break just because the circumstances changed. He said, I was going to say it makes you someone worth building something with. If that's something you wanted to know, the sky had gone fully pink and purple now, the orange fading at the edges. The cattle in the far pasture were moving to their settled positions for the night, that slow herd drift that happened every evening like clockwork. Somewhere in the near field, a nightbird started up. Maribel looked at the sky for a moment. Then she said, I think I already knew that. She paused. I think I knew that when you drove into town 3 days after I came to your ranch and you told me not to come back because you'd already figured out it wasn't safe. She turned to look at him. Most men would have made me come to them, because it would have felt like more of a choice. You removed the risk, he said. I removed the visible risk. There was still... I know, she said, there was still everything. But you thought about my safety before you thought about how the arrangement looked. And I noticed that. She looked back at the sky. I've been noticing things about you for a while, Silas. He didn't say anything. She said, Is that all right? He said, Yes, that's all right. They sat with that in the ordinary silence of two people who are figuring out what they are to each other in real time, without a script, making it up from honest materials. The wedding, when it came, was nothing like the ceremony they'd had in the front room of the Mercantile. Halverson's daughter, her name was Ruth, a composed young woman of 24, who had her father's stubbornness and her mother's everything else, was married on the first Saturday of June on the property at the edge of Red Willow where the Halverson grain operation had been running for 15 years. The ceremony was outside in the morning, in the shade of a stand of post oaks that Pete had never cut because his wife had told him not to, and he'd known enough not to argue about that particular thing. Silas and Maribel drove out together in the wagon. Silas wore his good shirt, which was becoming in danger of being called his wedding shirt from frequency of use. Maribel wore a dark blue dress that Silas hadn't seen before and that she'd apparently had in her trunk all along, waiting for an occasion that warranted it. When they pulled up to the Halverson property, Silas stopped the wagon at the edge of the gathered crowd and sat for a moment. He hadn't expected what he was looking at. He'd thought, a farm wedding, maybe 30 people, close family and neighbors. What he was looking at was closer to 100. Wagons and horses lined the fence for a quarter mile. He could see Dario Mendez and his family near the oak trees. He could see Elsa Croft in her black dress with the woman lawyer from the county seat beside her, which suggested a friendship had developed. He could see Vera Tullis with a group of women from the east end of town. He could see Cale Briggs and his wife and their children. He could see Hector Serrano near the front, standing straight in his good coat, already talking to someone. He could see people he recognized and people he didn't, people from the farms outside town, and people he'd only seen on Main Street in passing. People of the kind that don't often come to the same gathering because their lives don't ordinarily overlap. Maribel said, "There are a lot of people." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think it's because of what happened. I think people want to be somewhere together right now, where it feels like something good." He watched the crowd for a moment. A man he didn't know at all caught his eye from across the yard, raised a hand in acknowledgement, and looked away. Silas didn't know what the man knew, or whether he was connected to any of the events of the past month, or whether he just happened to be there for Ruth Halverson's wedding. It didn't matter either way. He got down from the wagon and helped Maribel down, and they walked into the gathering. What followed was the ordinary business of a community wedding, the ceremony, which was handled by a traveling minister who did it simply and without much embellishment, the food that materialized from multiple households. The conversations between people who'd been through something and were still processing it, the children who had no particular awareness of what the adults had been through and needed entertaining regardless. The music that started after the food, when someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a harmonica, and they turned out to know enough of the same songs to keep it going. Silas shook hands with more people than he'd shaken hands with in the previous year combined. Not all of the conversations were comfortable. A few people approached him with the careful manner of those who'd stayed on the boardwalk that morning and were now figuring out how to stand in the same space as him, not guilty enough to stay away, but aware enough of what they hadn't done to carry it with them. Silas didn't hold it against any of them. He wasn't the kind of man who carried that kind of ledger. The public ledger had served its purpose and was closed. The private one, the one where you kept track of who owed you what he'd never been much interested in keeping. Pete Halverson found him at the edge of the gathering while the music was going and stood beside him with a cup in each hand, one of which he gave to Silas without asking whether Silas wanted it. He said, "Ruth wants to thank you." Silas said, "I didn't do anything for Ruth." "You did something for this county," Pete said, "and this county is where Ruth is building her life. She understands that." He drank from his cup. "She's a smart girl." "Smarter than me. Gets it from her mother." Silas said, "You're not smart as you pretend to be." Pete said, "Don't tell anyone. I find it useful." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two men who'd been through something that had permanently changed the shape of their relation to each other without requiring either of them to say so directly. Halverson said, "I've been asked to sit on the Sheriff Oversight Committee." "My wife volunteered me," Maribel told me. "I'm going to be absolutely terrible at it," Pete said. "I don't know anything about law enforcement administration." Silas said, "You know when something's wrong. You know when someone's not being straight with you. You know how to say so in a room." He paused. "That's most of what a committee needs." Pete looked at him sideways. "You should be on it." "They didn't ask me," Silas said. "I'm asking you." Silas was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'll think about it." "You'll say yes, and then act like it took thinking," Pete said, and walked back toward his family. Maribel appeared at Silas's side a few minutes later. She'd been talking to Elsa Croft and Hector, and the flow of the gathering had brought her around to him without either of them planning it. She stood beside him and looked at the gathering and said, "Halverson's wife keeps looking at you." "She thinks I'm interesting," Silas said. "She'll figure out I'm not and stop." "She thinks you saved this county," Maribel said. "I made a list," Silas said. "Several people did the hard part," Maribel said. "That's not how she sees it. That's not how most of them see it." She gestured slightly with her cup toward the gathering. "They see someone who paid attention when no one else did. Someone who thought they were worth paying attention to." She paused. "You have no idea how rare that is, to be someone that people feel seen by." He looked at the gathering. He thought about all the conversations he'd had in kitchen tables, and at fence posts, and in back rooms. All the people who'd told him their amounts, and their dates, and their experiences while he'd written it down. He thought about what it had taken for each of them to say those things. How much courage had been sitting unspent for years in the people around him, waiting for the right conditions. He said, "People will do the right thing more often than you'd expect. They just need to believe it's possible," Maribel said. Yes, she looked at him. "Someone told me that once." He said, "Who?" She said, "Some quiet rancher I ended up married to." He said, "He sounds like he got lucky." She looked at him with that direct, steady gaze that was the most characteristically her thing about her, the gaze that assessed and didn't apologize for assessing. She said, "I'm the one who made the proposal, Silas. I'm the one who rode out to your ranch and said what I said. I don't do things I haven't thought through." She paused. "I don't regret it," he said. "Neither do I." She said, "Good," and she turned back to the gathering. The wedding went until late afternoon, when the light came in golden and sideways and made the post oaks look like something from a painting, and children fell asleep on their parents' laps without notice. And the fiddle and harmonica wound down to slower songs, and people started the long process of saying goodbye that community gatherings require when everyone has something worth taking home. Silas and Maribel drove back to the ranch in the evening light. The road was quiet. The horses moved at an unhurried pace. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable when they don't need filling. She said eventually, "I want to talk to you about something." He waited. She said, "The store. I've been thinking about what we do with it long term." She was looking at the road ahead. "Father isn't going to be able to run it indefinitely. His health is better than it was. The stress of the past 2 years took a toll he'll be recovering from for a while. But he's 63, and the work is physical, and eventually the question of what happens to the business becomes real." Silas said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I could run it. With Father as long as he's able, and then on my own afterward. But I can't run it from the ranch. I'd have to be in town most days." She paused. "Which changes things for us, for how we manage the ranch alongside the store." He thought about it. He said, "The ranch doesn't need me all day every day. The herd is small enough, and the operation is settled enough that I can do what needs doing and still drive you into town mornings and pick you up evenings when you need it. I'm not asking you to drive me," she said with a slight edge that wasn't sharp, but let him know that wasn't the right frame. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm saying I want to. Because it gives us time, which we don't have enough of. And because the mercantile matters to you, and what matters to you matters to me." He paused. "The ranch is mine. The store is your family's. That doesn't mean they don't both belong to our life." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is that not what you wanted to hear?" She said, "It's exactly what I wanted to hear. I just wasn't sure you'd say it." He said, "I'm working on saying things." She said, "I've noticed." He looked at her in the golden evening light, and she was looking at the road with the specific expression of a woman who's trying not to be more moved than she intends to be in a wagon on a public road, and he thought, this is what it looks like. Not the story version, not the clean version, not the version where two people find each other and everything resolves into happiness. This version, the one with a crooked barn and a recovering herd and a mercantile that needs work and a father-in-law who's rebuilding his health and a county that's learning to trust its institutions again, which will take years and will be imperfect in every direction. This specific, imperfect, real thing, he'd built a ranch on the wrong side of the county that nobody wanted. He'd built it out of stubbornness and solitude and the specific endurance of a man who didn't quit. And then a woman had ridden out to it on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at it and looked at him and decided that what he'd built was exactly what she needed, not despite its roughness, but because of it. Because a place that had been made to stand through hard things was the right kind of place when hard things were coming. He hadn't understood that when she'd said yes. He was starting to understand it now. When they pulled up to the ranch, the cattle were settled in the south pasture, moving slow in the evening cool. The barn was still crooked. He'd straightened the door last fall, but the structure itself had its particular lean that wasn't going away without major work he hadn't done yet. The garden along the south fence needed attention. The porch step that had been soft since February needed replacing before it went through entirely. Tomorrow's work. All of it, tomorrow's work. Maribel got down from the wagon and looked at the house for a moment in the fading light. She did this, sometimes looked at it in a specific way, not assessing it for problems, not comparing it to something better, just looking at it the way a person looks at a place they've decided is theirs. He'd noticed her doing it. She said, "Halverson asked if we'd come to dinner next week. He wants to talk about the oversight committee." Silas said, "I told him I'd think about it." She said, "And he said, I'll go." She nodded. Good. She picked up her bag from the wagon bed. She walked to the porch and paused at the top step. She said, "Silas." He looked at her. She said, "I knew what I was doing when I rode out here that day. I want you to stop not quite believing that." He held her gaze. She said, "I chose you, not the situation, not the arrangement, not the practical solution. I chose you. The arrangement just gave us a reason to start." He said, "I'm starting to believe it." She said, "Start faster." Then she went inside. He stood at the fence for a moment in the last of the light, one hand on the post, looking at the pasture and the cattle and the crooked barn and the darkening sky coming in from the west. He thought about the ledger, which was sitting on the shelf in the bedroom where he'd put it after the hearing, no longer useful as a working document, too significant to throw away. He thought about the 11 names in it, which had become 17 by the end, which had become the voices on Main Street, which had become testimony in a formal proceeding, which had become 6 years and a removal from office and a county that was learning to ask questions about the people it handed authority to. He thought about the woman inside the house, the one who'd come to him with a problem and a proposal, and the clear-eyed practicality of someone who'd stopped waiting for the right circumstances and decided to make them. He thought about what it had cost her, the uncertainty, the weeks of watching him disappear into the county and return without telling her everything, the marriage that had started as a strategy and become something neither of them had planned for and neither of them seemed to regret. He thought about Catherine one last time and the things she'd said about a man who didn't know how to want things for himself. He thought, "I'm learning." He pushed off the fence post and walked up the porch steps, remembering not to put his full weight on the second one. He'd replace it this week. It was past time. He went inside, and the door closed behind him, and the lamp was already lit in the kitchen, and the ranch that everyone had written off was quiet and full and exactly enough.